All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to start on time, stay on time today. Thanks for being here. I'm DeLoss Yonke with the RFD Radio Network, and certainly pleased to welcome you to the 2025 Field Advisor Forum hosted by the Illinois Soybean Association. We've already survived the hard part. The hard part was going from that parking lot to the door 16 through the wind tunnel, so now we're here and have a great opportunity to learn a lot of things over the course of the day. It's all about connecting you with the latest advancements in agronomic research made possible through funding from the Illinois Soybean Association Checkoff Program. We couldn't have said that a few years ago. You know, certainly a hat tip to ISA and the leadership that made the commitment to research. You know, everything's important, transportation, infrastructure, usage, demand, it's all important, but the research, locally done research for farmers to be more productive and more profitable, and the commitment, because you don't just do that 1 year. That's something that goes for a long period of time. So to make that kind of investment is certainly commendable. Today you'll learn about valuable resources that can support your work on the farm, and you'll gain actionable information from top researchers and industry experts that tackle some of the most pressing agronomic challenges. So we'll kick off the morning with a couple of presentations. We'll take a little break, and then we'll dive into another presentation, and then we'll have a panel discussion to finish the morning with independent crop consultants. Then lunch, and then announce Field Advisor Award winners. In the afternoon, we'll have breakout sessions. And if you haven't picked up an agenda yet, there's one over there, which also has the room assignments for each session. One of them is on the 6th floor, so you need to make sure you need to know where you're going to be. If you have any questions throughout the day, there are plenty of staff members around who can help. You can see their name tags and certainly be able and happy to assist. A couple of housekeeping things. Continuing education credits are available for certified crop advisors. They can be found in each presentation room on clipboards. We have folks watching online as well. This is on YouTube right now. It's on YouTube? It's on YouTube. Yeah, people are watching right now, say that. And instructions will be provided in the chat on, if you're watching, how you can still get credits that way. So yes, we're on YouTube. If you have to leave early, if a friend at home wants to participate, if you need to prove that you're here, try not to stand in front of the camera too long, but tell them to go to YouTube, search for Field Advisor. They can find the live stream of the main room and of the breakout sessions. And they'll all be recorded so you can watch, or if you can recommend them for someone else to watch later. Be sure to stop by the Field Advisor table, giveaways, details on upcoming webinars, and information on signing up for 2025 field trials, which include sulfur trials and a separate insecticide trial with Dr. Nick Sider. All right, now, hear from the members. We'll bring up to the podium Steve Pitstick, board member of Illinois Soybean Association, to give some welcoming remarks. Steve?
Good morning. As DeLoss said, I'm Steve Pitstick. I'm a farmer, Northeast Illinois, and a board member on the Illinois Soybean Association. It's kind of scary to think about. I've been doing this 50 years. I recently found my FFA record book from 1974 when I started with 3 acres of soybeans. I'm still trying to figure it out. Yesterday, went to get a haircut to make sure I look good for this. And the barber's like, "What do you do?" I'm like, "I'm a farmer." "What do you do this time of year?" I'm like, "I'm not sure." But as I thought about that to give this presentation today, I think about what I do as a farmer this time of year. It's tax work, it's going to meetings like today to learn about everything. Is it new fertility? Is it new planter attachments? Is it listening to the seed corn guy talk about 4 to 5 bushel better at a half-point dryer? Had I listened to him every year, I'd be having 500 bushel corn at 12%. We look at soybeans, we're trying to grow more. Every year I try to grow more. But I spend almost 0 time as a farmer trying to figure out who's going to buy that next product. Who's going to buy my soybeans? I just take the truck and dump it and hope I get a worthy price. So that's where the Soybean Association comes in at. 2018, after many years of doing other things in leadership and organizations, I got on the soybean board. I was looking for something to do. Started out, or during my 6 years there, right now I'm on the agronomy team. I've chaired the legislative group. I was vice chairman for 2 years and chairman for 2 years. The 2 years as being chairman, trying to look for direction, what I'm supposed to do as chairman and how to lead the group. I like mission statements, I like directions, I like goals. The thing that I came up with is that we need to make farming more profitable, make the farmer more profitable. How do we do that? It's kind of an equation. It's yield times price minus cost. We can't do much about lowering cost, but we can affect yield with programs like this to help you bring more yield. But we also cause problems for the marketing team because we have more soybeans to move. If you look at trendline growth in Illinois soybean production, it's 10 million bushels a year of growth that all of us are doing. We're raising more beans because we want to raise more, make more money. We want to do better. It's 28 semi-loads every day that have to find a new market. How do we do that? That's where the checkoff comes in. So we've got, the checkoff has 3 teams. One looks at agronomy, one looks at governmental affairs, and one looks at market development. The agronomy thing has brought this deal together today to help the production side. The government relations side looks at all things related to government. We can't lobby, the soy growers do that, but the checkoff board looks at things such as the new 45Z rules coming out on carbon intensities and whether UCO is a product that we have to compete with in the biodiesel market. We look at try to build trade. How do we find that next buyer of our soybeans? We've got lots of competition from around the world. Where do we find that next buyer? One of the things that we started about 5 years ago was a soy excellence program. And I've been to Egypt to see the results of it. What that does is teach people in the feed industry in Egypt how to use US soy. It's a fantastic program. They're using soy in fish diets. There's a lot of farmed fish there, a lot of chicken production. Fascinating to see. They're now the 4th largest importer of soy in the world because of that program. So we're seeing small growth all over. We look at this China market, it's a huge part of our offtake of our soybeans, but we've got to find that next buyer, whether it's Latin America, Northern South America, Indonesia, wherever. We've got to find that next buyer, and that's where the market development team works. One other thing that we started was the Soy Excellence or Soy Innovation Center. It's a virtual center, but it's trying to find that next maybe industrial use for soybeans, whether it's meal or oil. So we're trying to find, can we use soybean oil in place of motor oil? Can we use it in place of motor or petroleum for plastic production? Can we use soybean fibers for something? Something I heard about the other day was using soybean hulls as the medium for growing yeast. Tons of yeast being used in this country for all baking projects. Most of that's imported from China now. Can we find that next use? So we're trying to grow demand, trying to find that next place to use the soybeans. So what I encourage you is to do like I did and become one of those 24 people that makes decisions on those dollars going forward. Where do you invest the money, the checkoff dollars to find that next market? Be part of that team as we look forward. I've been doing this for 6 years. I'm not going to do it forever. Kenny Dallenberg here was part of it a long time ago, got things going. everybody here is part of that team, or most of that team is here. But I'd like to encourage you to be part of that and help yourselves and help fellow farmers. So we'll get on with today's program and figure out how to raise more soybeans. Thank you.
I appreciate your thoughts. I'm a little bummed, though, that 1974 was 50 years ago. Still trying to grasp around that. Did you say 10 million bushels a year? So that's 475 million pounds of soybean meal. And whatever, so 10 times 10, so 107 million pounds of soybean oil per year additional. So, yeah, that's a lot. Need to know what to do with it. But need to continue to grow that as well. All right. First speaker of the day, Dr. Fred Bilo, who leads the University of Illinois Crop Physiology, right? Yep. Physiology Laboratory, where he and his team of more than 12 academic professionals, undergraduate and graduate students conduct groundbreaking research on management practices to enhance corn and soybean productivity. Their findings from replicated field studies and other research are shared on the lab's website, making them accessible to the ag community. Also teaches an advanced crop production course for grad students and is a highly sought-after speaker. Are you speaking at Classic again this year?
I am.
Yeah, backed by popular demand. He's delivered presentations at conferences locally, nationally, and internationally. Don't ever tell him a secret, because he tells secrets all the time in his speeches, so don't confide in him with anything. But at the same time, his excellence in teaching and extension work has earned him numerous awards. He's a fellow of the American Society of Agronomy and lives on a small farm just outside of Champaign with he and his wife have 3 daughters. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fred Bilo.
Well, I could not be more honored to kick this event off, help celebrate 60 years of the Illinois Soybean Association. I genuinely hope that the research we do is useful to you in your farming. That's one of the products of our research. But I'm going to tell you the main product, the real product in our research, the one that has a lasting impact, I think I'm going to tell you. All that great lead up, it's not working. I turned it on, right?
You're on now.
Oh, I turned it off. Huh, my bad. The real product of our research is trained graduate students. That's what I am most proud of. And so what I'm showing you here is 6 years of the team that we use to do research and the graduate students we trained. I think there's 9 different PhD students depicted here, 14 different master's students. I know at least 4 of them are in the audience today working for you. So that's how we do our research. Don't be mistaken and think I have actually any research or equipment skill. I don't. It's these kids that have it. So that's the last 6 years. Here's today this year's team of graduate students. And I'm proud to say that this year, that's me in the center there. I'm proud to say that this year there's 2 people that are in charge of the Crop Physiology Laboratory because Dr. Connor Sible has recently been hired by the University of Illinois as a research assistant professor. And he is going to be my ultimate replacement. I mean, I'm older than the Illinois Soybean Association, 10 years older than the Illinois Soybean Association. And I'm not dead yet, but, I do have an expiration date. Currently, he and I are working together, so that means the students have 2 bosses to ask for. But, so there's Dr. Connor Sible. You'll notice he's got a lot of experience at Illinois, which makes him absolutely perfect to work for Illinois growers. So he started working with me in 2017, and as he and some of the other students of mine that are here will attest, it's pretty stressful working with me because this is what he looked like in 2017, and that's what he looks like now. Just kidding. You're going to get to hear him later. What a fantastic guy, and I couldn't be happier that he's going to ultimately take over. Now, I've been doing this for 40 years, so this is my 40th year. And I got a dirty little secret that I'm going to tell you soybean growers. And my dirty little secret is I spent almost all of my career working on corn. I mean, I was a corn guy. I did my master's, my PhD, my postdoc, and most of my work on corn. So there I am as a PhD student. That's going to prove to you that I actually did work in the laboratory. And that was so long ago. That was before they had smartphones, and they didn't even have color then. And here I am in a more recent photo. I spent 27 years working almost exclusively on corn, largely trying to figure out how corn used nitrogen and to make it better. But I did know some things about soybean. I knew that having soybean as a rotational crop for my corn was pretty good, and I did do that. And in the process of doing that, I discovered that if you were growing corn or soybean, it had a huge difference in soil tilth. So this is an example here. Anybody who's ever chisel plowed corn or soybean stubble, oh boy, you know those crops work up differently. And so we were studying the rotation effect. This is third-year continuous corn. There's first-year soybean right after a fall chisel plow, and talk about a difference in soil tilth. You know, on the soybean side, I could skip across here in my bare feet. Talk about mellow. But when I got to the corn side, you know, I might fall down, sprain my ankle, gouge my eye out on a piece of stalk residue. I mean, and of course, the problem is corn root balls. Soybean improves the tilth compared to corn, and it has to do with its root system. Corn is a fibrous root. Soybean is a taproot. Taproots naturally fracture soil compaction. So I knew that, even though I was a corn guy. Now, what I was really interested in is I was interested in this rotation of corn and soybean, because I knew if soybean was the previous crop to your corn scored 25 bushels better. Now, if you're growing corn continuously, it was a penalty. So I also knew that if soybean was your previous crop, you didn't have to put as much nitrogen on your corn, up to 40 pounds less. You know, that was what was known as the soybean nitrogen credit. Now I'm going to ask you a question related to soybean as a previous crop. I'm going to test your knowledge here. This is a multiple choice question. And so the question is, if you grow 60 bushel soybean, how much does that 60 bushel soybean, the nodules of that 60 bushel soybean crop, how much nitrogen does it give to the next year's corn crop? So you know soybean's a lot different than corn. You don't have to fertilize it with nitrogen because it gets some of its nitrogen from the nodules. Notice I said some, not all. So here's another key question. And this is going to help you answer how much nitrogen comes from a 60 bushel soybean crop. And so the question is, you know, how much of soybeans nitrogen comes from the nodules? Well, I'm going to tell you, it's about 50%. 50% is the scientific term for half. So about half. Where's the other half come from? The soil. So soybean gets about half its N from the nodules. And soybean's a fairly nitrogen, extensive requirements for nitrogen. So I'm going to show you this, and I'm going to use, knowing that half of it comes from the nodules, and knowing how much nitrogen soybean crop accumulates and where it puts it, I'm going to help you answer that question. How much does a 60 bushel soybean crop add? So what I'm showing you here is the uptake and partitioning for 60 bushel soybean. Partitioning means, you know, where you put it in the plant. So I'm going to tell you, over the course of the season, a 60 bushel soybean crop has to accumulate 245 pounds of N. It's about 4 pounds per bushel, half of which comes from the nodules. So I did the math. That's 123 pounds. The other 123 comes from the soil. Now, if I have this graph, I know how much it accumulates. I know half of it comes from the nodules. I know how much is in the grain. I can calculate how much nitrogen the soybean crop is leaving. So I've done that here. So I know that crop. I know that 60 bushel soybean crop has to accumulate 79 pounds of N. Well, we measured that. I know that 60 bushel soybean crop gets 123 pounds of that 245 from the nodules. And that means the 60 bushel soybean crop actually removes almost 60 pounds of nitrogen. So the answer is soybean removes 60 pounds of nitrogen. Okay, this is one of the biggest myths of all time. Soybean does not add nitrogen to the soil. I know I learned that when I was a student. I learned 1 pound per bushel. I actually taught that for a few years incorrectly, and it's exactly the other way. There is no such thing as a soybean nitrogen credit because soybean is a huge nitrogen requiring crop. It's actually the other way around. You need about a pound. Soybean removes about a pound of N per bushel. So I know a lot of you already know that, but in case any of you don't and are still thinking soybean adds N to the soil, that is completely wrong. Now, I'm not going to talk about it, but that begs the question, should I put a little N on my soybean crop? I don't have time. But I will tell you, when we do a progressive soybean system, we like to put a little ammonium sulfate up front to soybean. Certainly makes it greener, and it might improve it because of this. All right, well, I'm going to talk about soybean yield. And I'm going to ask you another question. You know, what is the soybean yield gap? I know you've heard this, the yield gap, right? And the yield gap is the difference between the record yield and the average yield. And you know, there's a new world record yield for soybean. It's this guy down in Georgia. Alex Harrell this year has a new soybean world record, 218 bushels. I mean, I think it's actually 218.24, something down here. They carry that out to 10,000ths of a bushel, but I'm going to call it 218. He broke his previous record. I mean, that'd be a reasonable corn yield, 218 bushels. I had the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Harrell a couple months ago. Right, he spent an hour telling me how I had to adjust my planter with flags, and then he spent another hour telling me I needed to take tissue tests of the leaves. And Dr. Sible's going to talk about our work, funded by the Illinois Soybean Association on tissue testing next. So Mr. Harrell's the world record holder, 218 bushels. I know you're thinking, well, what's the crop physiology record? Okay, 118. Again, Stephen Swartz holds that record in our lab. 100 bushels off of the world record, but still, you know, those are both irrigated. The U.S. record yield, average yield, and it might be different this year, I'm not sure, around 53 bushels. Happily, you Illinois guys are greater because Illinois average record is 66 bushels, both 22 and 23. And so the yield gap is the difference between the highest and the average. And I'll use the world record versus the average yield and calculate the yield gap, 165 bushels. That's the opportunity to increase soybean yield with better crop management, closing that yield gap. And you don't have to close it all the way to have a serious increase in soybean yield. Now, I told you I was mostly a corn guy. And I'm going to give you my history into working on soybean. I'm going to go back to 2007. And in 2007, what was then Monsanto, they made a really big deal about saying, we need to double crop production in order to feed a growing population. They said in order to feed 9 billion people, we need to double the production of all crops, both corn and soybean. All right, by the way, the population of the world today is 8 billion. I think it just happened on New Year's. And it's going to take 14 years to get to 9 billion, so we have a little time to do it yet. Now, when they came out with this, corn yield was 150 bushels. You know, I did the math. The target's 300. And soybean was about 40. And so the target would be 80. Now I was mostly interested in corn in those days. And Monsanto said they were going to do it with biotech and marker-assisted selection. And I thought, well, I'm pretty sure there's some other management that has to go along with this. And, you know, how could I get in on this gig? And so that's when I launched the 7 Wonders of the Corn Yield World, 2008. You know, and that was like me getting a top 10 song on the list. I was off to the races with this. I mean, I milked this puppy to death, I'll tell you. and fairly successful. So in 2012, the Illinois Soybean Association came to me. And they said, you know, we like this 7 wonders of the corn yield thing. You know, can you come up with a similar concept for soybean? And I thought, great, I might not be a one-hit wonder. And they said to me, we'd like to make soybean yield sexy. And we have Illinois checkoff dollars that, you know, might go into that. And oh, man, did that get my attention. I mean, as a corn guy, if I could get my hands on some of those rare Illinois soybean checkoff dollars, you know, I could put that off the bucket list. Had to make soybean yield sexy, and that was fairly difficult. So I leaned on my friend Victoria, and Victoria said if it's going to be sexy, it has to be secret. And hence, the 6 secrets of soybean success was launched. Now, I have to tell you, I really didn't have a clue what the 6 secrets were. And I don't keep a secret very well because I'm going to tell them all to you. But in order to get my hands on those checkoff dollars, I came up with these 6 things. I was pretty sure weather was number 1, and I looked at the literature, and I knew these things were important. But I did not have enough experience with soybean to actually give them, to rank them correctly or give them a value. Now, I'm happy to say, after 5 years of working on this, with support of Illinois Soybean Association, we had learned a lot of stuff. All right, they outlined some of the stuff that we learned 5 years later. Still couldn't put a ranking on it. But now, happily, 13 years later, we've worked on soybean long enough that I am able to launch the new 6 secrets of 80 bushel soybean. Remember, that's the target to feed the growing population. What this is I'm going to rank, and I'm going to be able to give an average bushel per acre value of those 6 factors that each year can have a positive, well, bad news is sometimes negative, if you're not lucky or not intelligent enough, impact on soybean yield. So I'm going to go through all these. I'll show you the value, and then I'll show you how, if you get those right, it can lead to 80 bushel soybean. Now, there are some prerequisites, you know, what we call table stakes, some things that you have to have in place first. And I don't mean they're not important, they're actually crucial. But in and of themselves, they don't add yield, or they don't have to be done every year. So here's the crucial prerequisites to the 6 secrets. I mean, I can't tell you how important drainage is to soybean. Boy, soybean hates wet feet. Also doesn't like compacted soil. Weeds don't add yield, by the way. You know, I don't have to tell you how they take it away. Hey, remember the good old days when we first started this? We would let the weeds grow up good and tall, hit them once with glyphosate, and then by the time we harvested our 40 bushels, there wasn't a weed out there. Did that feel good? Of course, now we have resistant glyphosate, resistant weeds, and now we really got to focus on weed control. I'm going to harp on this one a little bit, but so you got to have the right pH for soybean, and then you got to have the right levels of P and K based on soil tests. So those are the prerequisites. All right, and given that, what are the 6 factors that each year can have a positive impact on soybean yield? I'm going to start at the top, work my way down. I'll justify some of these with some actual data. You already know the factor that has the biggest impact on your soybean yield, the one you have the least control over, the weather, Mother Nature. So I know it. I know there's allegedly such a thing as good weather. I think it's called average weather. But I also know there's a lot of worse than average weather. And you know what you do when the weather's not working for you? You refer to the weather using that pregnant dog term. You say, this weather's a real pregnant dog. And I can show you lots of examples of pregnant dog weather here. I mean, here's some of them here. There's too much precipitation. There's not enough precipitation. And this is the worst one. That's precipitation in frozen form. Hail. That is a really bad day for graduate student research, I have to tell you. You have no idea the crying and teeth gnashing when they're worrying about getting their degree. Talk about a pregnant dog weather year. Here's another thing that's affected by the weather. The planting date. I seem to be reminded about this every wet spring. I'm going to harken back to 2019. 2019, it's May 15th, and we haven't put a seed in the ground yet. Doesn't look like we're going to put any in that day. Can you imagine how anxious I am if we hadn't put a seed in the ground yet by May 15th? We didn't plant soybean until June that year. I blame the weather. Now, related to planting date and weather, here's a key question for you. Which crop should you plant first? Should you plant corn or soybean? I'm going to tell you what I learned in class, and I'm going to tell you what I taught in class for many years. I learned that soybean has a higher minimum temperature required for germination than does corn. It's called the base temperature. So I learned that the base temperature for soybean was 55 degrees and corn was 50. Right? And that meant you plant corn first. And that's what we did. Now, it turns out that is completely wrong. I mean, back in the day when this was devised, remember we were doing something called bin run? We were saving the soybean from the year before and then planting it. Right? You had to plant a lot of it. Didn't have the high quality. It probably did need 55. But now that we're paying $80 a bag for premium seed and it's treated and it's illegal to bin run it, turns out that soybean actually has the same minimum temperature to germinate than corn. So I'll tell you a story. I can't remember when this occurred. I think it was 2017. There was a local BASF guy that I knew, A.J. Woodyard, and the story was he planted soybean in March. Either he was bored or this company made him do it. I'm not sure. But, we all knew he did it, right, because we got social media. And we're going, oh, what an idiot A.J. is. That's not going to work. And he got 85 bushels. He went, oh, that's a one-off. It'll never happen again. He did it the next year, and it was 100 bushels. And we went, maybe we should look at what was the planting date we planted our soybean trials and see if there's any relationship between early planting. So we went back 8 years worth of soybean trials. This is not a planting date study. These are individual trials, and we plotted, of the soybean trials we did over 8 years, what was the date we actually planted them. I mean, we never planted anything before April 23rd because we're so busy planting corn. Do you see the relationship here? For every day after April 23rd that we planted the soybean, we lost almost a half a bushel. Looks like AJ was on to something. So the next year, we're going to put soybean out as soon as we can. April 3rd, we plant soybeans. 17 days later, we got a hard frost. We got this. See this? Look at the growing point on every plant is dead. Now, here's my question. Are these history? Is this a dig up and a replant? Is this history? What do you think? Notice there's still some green on the cotyledons. And I'm going to tell you a biological thing about soybean. Is there are actually buds down there at the base of the cotyledons and the stem that provide a mechanism for regrowth. When I was a student, I learned the growing point of corn is below ground until V6. By the way, that's completely nonsense. If you frost corn at all, it's history. You're replanting it. But soybean is another story. So I convinced my student here, let's let it regrow out of it. We actually couldn't have replanted this until sometime into May. So I'm like, let's let it grow out and see what happens. And it grows back out in a Y branch. I know you've seen that, right? 2 main stems. And so this is what it looked like 43 days after the frost. A little slower regrowing out of it than I would have liked. This is what it looked like 61 days after the frost. That's the 21st of June, so we haven't closed the canopy yet. But 90 days after the frost, you really couldn't tell it had been frosted. And this thing yielded 85 bushels. And that really got our attention. And we said, we need to actually do a planting date study. So for the last 3 years, we've looked at different planting dates. And then we thought, well, if we plant at different times, do we have to do different management to optimize it? So this is a planting date by management study. The first 2 years are on our website reports. The third year is done. It's just sitting on my desk waiting for me to look at it, which I'm going to do in my spare time, which pretty much means never. But we'll ultimately have the third year on there, and I'll show you some of the data from the third year as well. And I'll use this to talk about some of the secrets. And I'm going to focus just first on the planting dates. So 16 different varieties, a couple different managements, and what we did is each year we planted them at 4 different dates. I mean, we got it in as quick as we could. Those are the earliest dates we could put it in. We also have a late planting date, and we have 2 in the middle. And you know, the normal is to plant mostly in somewhere in between here, right? So now, why would you want to plant soybean early? 2 reasons. One reason you want to plant it early is because you're going to get more leaf area coverage on the ground before the longest day. So I have a picture here showing you from one of them. This is a picture taken on June 15th. And I'm comparing the different planting dates, the April 23rd to May 9th. You know, and you can see that it makes a big difference. I mean, if I compare June 15th to April 23rd, I mean, there's a lot more green there. And so I'm trying to increase the leaf area light interception. You know, if you go to July 31st, I really can't tell much difference looking at the first 2 dates, but I can see the other dates. So that's one reason you would plant early. Leaf coverage by the 21st of June. Here's another one. You know, if you strip these leaves off at this date and you look at it, the other major advantage of an early planting date is you end up with more nodes. So I'll show you an example here. This is what they looked like on May 31st, and we stripped the leaves off. And that's the earliest planting date. Notice it's got 1 more node, 4 more nodes, 12 nodes. More nodes! Why do you want more nodes? Well, it has to do with the yield components of soybean. So, you know, you can make soybean yield into a math equation by the yield components. And the soybean yield is a product function of pod number per acre, seeds per pod, weight per seed. This is what it looks like in talk. That's what it looks like in a picture. So pod number per acre is actually a function of 2 things. It's plants per acre and pods per plant. It's not just plants per acre, you know, because the damn thing branches and you have more nodes with pods and more than 1 pod at a node. So you got to change one of these to increase yield. Here's my question for you. Which one is usually the most important? So of all of these, which one is usually the most important one to impact soybean yield? You know how you do a soybean yield estimate, right? You take the hula hoop and you throw it out, and then you count all the pods, and then you make up a yield after that. That's how it's done, right? So a soybean yield, pod number per acre is usually the most important. Now what determines pod number per acre? There's even more math here. So pod number per acre is a function of node number and pods per node. So if I plant early and I get an extra node or 2, I have the opportunity for more pods. No, normally a soybean plant that you're going to grow is going to have 20 nodes. 16 of them could have pods. And I'm going to tell you that it's the closest leaf that supplies the energy and the nutrition for the pods and beans at a given node. Closest leaf. So Dr. Sible's going to talk about this, you know, when it comes to tissue testing. Which leaf do I test? Now, and I'm also going to tell you, and this number is fairly shocking, but I know this because, you know, I have graduate students, and you can set them out there to count it. I mean, you can squeeze a lot of juice out of the grad student while you're blackmailing them for their degree. And I'm going to tell you that 1 more pod in every soybean plant's worth 2 bushels. Just 1. How on earth is that possible? How could just 1 more pod on every soybean plant be worth 2 bushels? All right, you got to go back to the yield components, and you got to look at another one, seeds per pod. So seeds per pod, how many seeds per pod has a very strong environmental and genetic control? Usually it's 3 seeds per pod. But you know, under bad conditions, it's less than that, right? I'm annoyed when the pod only has 1, but it's usually 3. So if conditions are bad, it's only 1. But if you have really good conditions and certain genetics, you can get 4 or even 5. Remember when the 5-bean pod craze hit? I can't tell you how much time I spent looking for that 5-bean pod. And I am embarrassed to say I've never found one, despite a lot of time looking. I hope that doesn't disqualify me for the checkoff funding. My student found one. There it is right there. He tried to sell it to me, but I took a picture of it. So that's important, because if you take pod number per acre and seeds per pod, you end up with seed number. And seed number is almost always the main determinant of soybean yield. So I'm going to show you 133 trials that we did, individual trials over a 7-year period, where I'm looking at the correlation, the relationship between seed number and soybean yield. And it is very positive. That's why node number is so important. It gives me opportunity to produce more seed. Now, I don't want to forget weight per seed, right? That's pretty important, how much they weigh. Don't you hate it when you harvest what we call BBs, right? You know if they were bigger, you'd have a higher yield. Here's another question for you. What does an average soybean seed weigh? Does anybody know what an average soybean seed weighs? Well, my students know this. 150 milligrams is an average weight of a soybean seed. Notice I'm using the metric milligram to make this appear more scientific. Now, if you could increase the weight of each seed just 2 milligrams, that'd be worth a bushel, 2 milligrams. So seed weight is an opportunity, but it's not as important when it comes to soybean yield as seed number. Again, these same 133 trials, there's the relationship between seed weight and yield, and it's much less than seed number. I don't know if this is an opportunity or that's just the way it is. One thing I will tell you is yield components don't play nice together, because seed number and seed weight are negatively related. And if you're going to grow a high soybean yield, Mr. Harrell has somehow figured out how to break that negative relationship. All right, well, back to the planting date study. The idea is more nodes. Now you know why. I'll show you what the impact in each year was on yield. And I'm gonna average it over for this. I'll average it over the varieties and the managements. So I'll show you that later. 2022, that's the average yield. Look at that straight down, highest yield early, about a half a bushel per acre per year. We did it again in 2023, and this just proved we didn't make the data up. The first date wasn't as good as the second date. I blame the weather, so not always. But still, you'll notice early is better than late. And then here it is this year, again, the earliest, the highest. And I've seen a quantum shift in Illinois to plant soybean ahead of corn. I think in our research trials this year, we planted all our soybean trials first, then corn, first time ever. So I've averaged these up here for you over the 3 years between early and late, and you'll notice it's straight down, about a half a bushel per acre per year. That's the single biggest thing you can do to increase soybean yield, is plant it earlier, and it doesn't cost any more. The seed costs the same. So, weather's number one. What's number two? I've already alluded to this. Number two is genetics and variety. Oh, man, you have no idea how important this is. I talk to growers, and they just agonize days on what corn hybrid they're going to plant, and then they turn around and buy any old damn soybean. Is it round? Who cares? Plant it. Big mistake. There is a huge difference in yield among soybean varieties. And we've looked at this over the years. I'll talk about our soybean variety testing. Remember, I said there was 16 varieties in each year, and I'll show you this. I'll show you 1 year. I'll show you 2022, and what I'll do, I can't show you everything, so I'll take the earliest planting date and the latest planting date, and I'll show you the range in yield among those 16 varieties as a function of planting date. And so it's this range I'm showing you, right, between the highest and the lowest. Look at how big that is. That's 32 bushels if I planted early. It's only 11 bushels if I planted later, happily, but the yields are lower. So I show you these varieties here, and I want you to notice that they range in relative maturity from 2.4 to 2.7 to 4.2. That's the difference in relative maturity. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you what the relative maturity was of the top half, and then I'll compare it to the bottom half. I put those numbers there. Do you see any trends here? Now, notice on both planting dates, the top half tends to have higher numbers than the bottom half. I mean, it's not a hard and fast rule, but I certainly see the relationship. And I plotted this relationship here to make it clearer. What we typically see is the fullest relative maturity for the region gives the highest yield. I think it has something to do with using the whole season. I don't know about you. And I don't know about you. Do you know how annoyed I am when I harvest soybean at 8% moisture? I mean, makes me want to get out the garden hose. So why didn't I use the fullest relative maturity and get a higher yield, and maybe it's a higher moisture? Now, almost everybody would tell me, if we're going to plant in the middle of June, we can't plant a full relative maturity. Wrong. Still the highest maturity for the region. So I cherry-picked these two, right? This is comparing the early and the latest planting. But when I look at all 3 years and I average it over the planting dates, that's what I've done here. So this is averaged over the planting dates. Yield is a function of maturity group, all 3 years. And this is a fancy regression equation that I could tell how much yield I might gain by changing one relative maturity group. And averaged over all 3 years, one increase in maturity group is worth 6 bushels. And by the way, I'm pretty sure the higher maturity group seed doesn't cost any more. So that's one of the biggest factors you can do. All right, well, we're going to move down here, and I'm going to alert you right now that all the rest of them are way less important than these two. Way less important. What do you suppose number 3 is? Row spacing. Now, I know a lot of you are in 15-inch rows. Some of you are in 30-inch rows. We can't plant 15-inch rows with our 4-row equipment, but we can plant 20-inch rows. And so we compare 20-inch rows to 30-inch rows. And you know the advantage of a narrow row is it closes the canopy quicker, intercepts more light. Sometimes there's a disadvantage that there's less air movement that goes down that row, and that could lead to certain diseases like white mold. But the idea is intercept more light. And in our variety testing trials, we've looked at row spacing. Now, I don't have time to show you all the data, but I will tell you that if you plant early, row spacing doesn't matter. 30 is as good as 20s. If you plant late, you need the 20. And it's the exact same thing with population, too. If you were to vary the population, if you plant early, you don't need as many plants. If you plant late, you need more. You want to intercept that light faster. So you don't need a 15-inch double row planter if you're planting early. Apparently the soybean has enough time. All right, what about number 4? Number 4 is foliar protection. Fungicide and insecticide. Again, we've also looked at foliar protection as a function of planting date. And I don't have time to show you all the data, but I will tell you that the value of foliar protection, oddly enough, is independent of planting date. Doesn't matter when we plant it. 3 to 6 bushels advantage. And we can often see it. What about, what's number 5? This one really surprises me because this would be number 2 for corn. But it's way less important for soybean. I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it. And when I originally came up with 6 secrets, I had it higher. Number 5 is fertility. Fertility is not as important for soybean as it is for corn. Now I don't mean to. I'm not going to tell you that 80 bushel soybean doesn't need a lot of fertility. It does. I can show you that. I can show you for my 6 favorite nutrients how much of each of those nutrients is required to produce 80 bushel soybean. So see these numbers here? This is how much the crop has to suck up over the course of the season, usually from the soil or from fertilizer, or remember, half of that N comes from the nodules. And I also say how much of each of these elements is removed from the grain when you harvest 80 bushel soybean. So when you harvest an 80 bushel soybean, this is how much of each of these elements you're taking off of your farm and sending someplace else. And if times are good and there's no tariffs, this all ultimately ends up in China, if you're lucky. And that's fertilizer placement. Now you say, well, I don't have 80 bushel soybean, or I have more than 80 bushel soybean, so I can show you the coefficient. You know, if you tell me the yield multiplied by that coefficient, you can estimate it. Now I know you see these coefficients vary. I know the fertilizer companies have these coefficients. They tend to be a little higher than the ones we have because we've actually measured it. Now, we also looked at fertilizer in the management yield potential trials. And if I looked at something like this and I said, well, I got higher yield if I plant earlier, almost certainly I'm going to need more fertilizer, right? Because of the coefficient, the amount required. So that's the question. Do I need more fertilizer if I plant early and less fertilizer if I plant late because the yield is so much? That's what we thought. But it is exactly the opposite. Early planted soybean requires less fertility than later planted soybean. It doesn't make any sense. Early planted soybean requires less fertility than later. And the data shows that these first 2 points, almost non-responsive to fertility, less than a bushel. But the later planted 2 dates, especially the late one, over 2 bushels. That's exactly opposite the way it should be. And I'm going to tell you why that is. We went back and we looked at our soil test data. We take a soil test on all of the trials. So we looked at our 133 trials. These weren't fertilizer trials. We sampled the soil. 133 trials, and we just recently published this. So we sampled the soil and looked at 14 soil attributes, basically a soil test. And we looked at the relationship between that soil test and yield. And I'm only going to show you one element, right? You can look at the paper for the rest of them. I'm only going to show you one element. I'll show you potassium. Everybody knows how important potassium is for soybean yield. And so when we look at each of these 33 trials, the relationship between soil test, potassium, and yield, the relationship is positive, but the coefficient is small. So that number means that only 10% of the variation in that yield could be accounted for due to variation in the soil test. We're like, what? When we divided these trials into when they were planted, so we used May 24th as the cutoff. So when we divided them into those planted before May 23rd and after 23rd, notice, early planted soybean, there's no relationship between the soil test and yield. Late planted soybean, very positive relationship. Well, I also told you in our management trials, when we planted late, we needed the fertilizer. When we planted early, we didn't. Why? Well, let's think about it. When you plant the soybean crop early, you plant that thing in April, it grows so slow that the soil can keep up and supply the nutrition soybean needs. But if you're planting it in June, when it's warmer, it's growing so rapidly that the soil cannot supply it. And then you got to have the fertilizer. I know this doesn't make sense, but you should plant your poorest fertility fields first and your better ones second, right? Because of when the soybean takes it up. All right, well, one more, and then I'm almost done. What's number 6? And this has to do with all the fantastic stuff that you can put on the seed treatment. So I know you know the answer to this. Do you know what a soybean seed that has no seed treatment is called? I mean, other than cheaper? Naked. I love the sound of that. Soybean seed is naked. I mean, kind of sexy. It gets me a little aroused. Naked seed? Got no seed treatment? And when it comes to seed treatment, you got a lot of choices. All right, there's 50 shades at least of soybean seed treatment, except gray. I've never seen gray. I think gray's a little abusive. So you can put protection products on the seed. You can put biologicals on the seed. I'm not going to talk about that, but we have a huge project with the U.S. Soybean Board to look at biologicals on soybean seed. You can put micronutrients on soybean seed, and we have had some success looking at molybdenum and cobalt to help nitrogen fixation. But mostly what I'm going to talk about is protecting the seed, from insects, diseases, or nematodes. As much as I like the sound of naked seed, I don't like the result because typically it doesn't emerge as well. And I don't have time to show you the data, and we don't have as many comparisons, but our trial does have at least one comparison of naked seed versus treated seed. And what we see, this one makes sense. If you're planting early, you need the seed treatment. If you're planting late, seed treatment doesn't matter. I hate to tell you that. So, all right, I'm going to wrap it up here. I've optimized the value of each of the 6 secrets and then see how they sum up to 80 bushels. Now, by the same token, if one of these is non-optimized, I will guarantee you're going to grow less than 80 bushels. That's easy. I didn't tell you, but all of these things interact with each other, and the way to get more than 80 is to have a positive interaction. But what you want to focus on for high yields is the prerequisites and these ones at the top. So to grow 80 bushels of soybean, you got to have the right prerequisites. You got to have drainage, you got to have weed control, you got to have the right pH. And then you got to optimize each of the 6 secrets and their positive interactions, and you especially, if the weather permits, have to plant early, get the right variety, fullest relative maturity for the region, typically gives the highest yield. All right, well, I'm going to end here. I'm going to tell you that research is expensive, and that your checkoff dollars help and support our research is hugely appreciated. These are all the people and companies that supported our research. All right, they gave us product, machinery, money, seed, money. Thanks to the Illinois Soybean Association for supporting your research. I hope you view this as money well spent. And then finally, I want to thank the Illinois Soybean Association, be able to celebrate their birthday. Especially, I want to thank you for attending. And did I leave time for questions?
We have a couple minutes.
Shocking. So I'd be honored to ask a question. Who's got the first question? Who's got the second question? Yes, sir.
Right here.
Right here, ma'am.
So you're talking about the maturity of soybeans, or
Maturity group, correct.
what does that say about or anything about planting mid-season, full season, mid-season, early season soybeans?
So soybean are classified into maturity group based on their latitude of best adaptation. And technically, scientifically, you're supposed to use Roman numerals. You don't get to use Roman numerals very often, only maturity groups and the Super Bowl. But nobody uses the Roman numeral. So a higher maturity group number means it's actually adopted to the southern latitudes. So up in Canada, it would be double zeros. We're in the 2 to 4 range. And so what I'm saying is, a lot of you, I'm sure, are planting 3s and 3-1s. That's the latitude range we're in. But what we see is the highest yield tends to come from the 4.2s that would typically be grown in Kentucky or Tennessee. That's what I mean by maturity group. That was an agronomy lesson that I answered. It doesn't look like I answered your question. Well, yeah. What people tell me, they say to me, well, we know we get a higher yield than if we plant fuller, but we got a lot of soybean to harvest, and we can't have it all ready on the same day, and so we're going to plant some that are earlier that we can get the combine out sooner. And that's absolutely true, ma'am. Absolutely. I mean, that was another question somewhere over here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So population is like row spacing. We hear that if you heard me talk about corn, I'd say you got to have more plants. When it comes to soybean, actually, less gets by. So we used to plant 160, drop 160. Now I think we're shooting for 120. I'm going to say in Illinois, usually 120 is the sweet spot. Some guys say, well, you can get by with 70. You know what happens when I plant 70? They've got these huge branches, and then the branches are loaded with pods, and the damn thing breaks off before the combine head comes through. But the if you plant early, you can get by with less population. I'm not saying you can half it, but if you're planting in June, you better put 160 in. If you're planting in the beginning of April, you might drop 110. Did I answer your question?
All right.
All right, well, thank you so much. I'm going to stick around. If you got a secret question, I'll be happy to answer it to you. So really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Fred. Hey, Fred, can we sneak away and do a little interview? Well, do you need to grade his presentation? Okay, all right. We'll make it happen. All right, so already been mentioned before, Dr. Connor Sible, Research Assistant Professor in the Department of Crop Sciences here at the U of I. He has 2 degrees from here, Master's in PhD. His research focuses on corn and soybean production systems with an emphasis on optimizing the interaction between products and practices to boost yields. During his graduate studies, he categorized biological and biostimulant products, uncovering how, where, and why they improve fertilizer efficiency and yields. Current work includes using agronomic inputs and innovative crop residue management techniques to enhance nutrient release and improve soil nutrient supply. He shared his research widely, presenting at, I almost said wildly, kind of like to see that, presenting at local and regional field days, university extension conferences, national trade shows, and international events, originally from Byron, the stacks, right, up north. And so in the north central part of the state, and he likes to be walked by his dogs in his spare time. So please welcome Dr. Connor Sible.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here, and spent a lot of time working with Dr. Bilo, like you said. Been here at Illinois, what I like to say, true Illini inbred. But it makes me proud. I'm happy to be a part of this institution, especially because I am from Byron, grew up in the state. I'm very familiar with here, and it's always fun and exciting when I get to do work that goes back to those people that I grew up with, my neighbors, go home, things like that. So really do enjoy it. Just those that may have been familiar with me going through Dr. Bilo's program, and what a lot of Dr. Bilo's students do, they often go to industry. And so I was going to do the same thing. I was going to go down product development, something like that. And in the very last year of my graduate work, got a lot of interest in the trials we're doing, had too many questions, and said, I think I want to try that academic thing instead. And here I am now, just got hired as a research assistant professor. And when you get hired as a professor, they say you're going to do certain things, research, extension, teaching. And they give you some advice, which is always good. I like advice. They say when you teach, there's certain times of teaching that are better than others, right? You don't want to teach an 8 a.m. class. Nobody will be there. You don't want to teach after lunch. They'll all be asleep. I said, that's fine. I can work with that. We'll figure it out. And so we got through all that advice. I was about to leave, and they said, oh, there's one thing we forgot. You're at Illinois. And so the one thing you never want to give a lecture after is Dr. Fred Bilo. Well, here I am. So we'll see how it goes. But really excited about this opportunity. And some of the questions we start to get are tissue testing as part of fertility management. And when we do projects as researchers, we always love when those projects are of interest to our growers. And I can tell you, since we started this project, I think I have had more emails, texts, phone calls about what are we learning before we even started. So that gets me excited and a little nervous, right? So we got a lot of interest in it. But why are we looking at tissue testing? What's going on? Why do we tissue test? I think it's important to look at a history of soybean yields. So this is from the USDA. And this is the U.S. average, not the Illinois average, soybean yield. So obviously the green line there is the yield for a given year. Bounces around based on the weather. But that trend line shows us that on average we're increasing yield as a country about 0.4 bushels per acre per year. And so that means yields continue to climb and continue to go. And Dr. Bilo talked really importantly about high yields and high nutrient requirements. So if yields are going up, does that also mean we have higher nutrient requirements? And we can look at a different way to put those numbers on the screen, right? So I went to 60 bushel soybean, following more on our trend line. But the trends are the same, right? So we need a lot of these nutrition. So this is the total amount of nutrition that a 60 bushel soybean crop would need. This is how much removed with that grain. And then you have your nutrient removal coefficients. We can do the math, like we said, we showed an example earlier. But the other thing to also think about is if we're increasing yield 0.4 bushels per acre per year, how much more nutrition are we going to have to do to keep that going? And so there it is. And it doesn't seem like much intuitively, right? And I'll put a note on here. This is straight P or K, so you have to do the conversion for the P2O5 or K2O. So those might look a little low, keeping that in mind. But we need over a pound of nitrogen per acre per year now to keep up with that yield trend. We're going to need over a pound of potassium, half a pound or so of P2O5 equivalents. We're needing more nutrition. When we think soybean, traditionally, where is that probably coming from? Either the soil or last year's fertilizer from what's left over from that corn crop. And so we can then think about what is in the soil. And you always look at these numbers and you just think, well, why are we fertilizing? Look how much nutrition is in our soils. Thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds. That's in your acre furrow slice, right? But then you look at the amount available. The tricky challenge here is this is how much we need in a single season, and at any given point, this is only how much is available at a time that we might sample it. And these things go back and forth, and they do release over time, but is this enough to get us what we need? And there's some other challenges to that availability. It's not that this is always the case. So if we look at things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, those release via mineralization because they're in your organic matter. And the others, potassium, calcium, magnesium, right, those tend to release via weathering. Now, if anyone here has the perfect model that can predict exactly how much that acre will either mineralize or weather this year, I will sign up today and hopefully be retired in 5 years with the amount of money that would make. It's really, really hard to predict what that soil will release that year. And so when we do soil testing, because when I think about nutrient management for any crop, soil testing, we almost every acre, I think it's a soil test every 5 years at least or so, trying to understand what's the soil potential. But that's the total quantity, but there's the temporal components for nutrient uptake demand. And alluding to what Dr. Bilo said, early beans, they grow to a higher yield, but they grow slower, so the rate per day is less. And when we look at the total amount, I think that's when a lot of us think, right? If I have a yield target, I know how much fertility that crop will need. But how often do we think when in the season the crop needs certain components? And that's one of the things that, we've got the infamous nutrient uptake charts. If you're a Bilo student, you know that you're required to at least put one of these in every presentation. But this is the total phosphorus uptake in this case for soybean and where it's going in the crop throughout the season. So the green is in the leaves, that yellow there is in the stems and the pods, and then that blue is going to the grain. Phosphorus, a lot of it goes to the grain. How many of us are in this room because we liked biology instead of math? Right? That's me. I started as an engineer. I said, whew, that's a lot of math. Going to biology. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of math in biology, and some people that are smarter than I am, one of Dr. Bilo's former students, Dr. Marcos Lohman, he looked at this and said, I can do math. Actually, he could do calculus. And if you differentiate and take the derivative of the curve, you can actually get the daily uptake. Now, this was really exciting, but I also was mad at Marcos because I had to drive 3 hours north to go find my high school math teacher and say, hey, I actually use calculus in real life. Bummer. She was right. But when you do that, when you integrate this curve, you get the seasonal phosphorus uptake. This is amount of nutrition needed per acre per day. And that looks like this. And the thing you'll notice with soybean is there's two distinct phases. The initial growth, when things are kind of going slow, you need less than 0.2 pounds P2O5 per acre per day. But in the peak growth, we're almost needing a pound of P2O5 per acre per day for 60 bushel soybean. Guess what? That number's pretty constrained for the amount needed per day compared to yield. So if you want 80 bushel, that goes above a pound per acre per day. Now, the interesting thing about soybean is it's very different than corn. Corn grows very fast in a short window, right? So those that don't have livestock know that you put the final post-emergence herbicide pass out, and you spend a couple weeks in the Ozarks. And when you come back, your corn crop went from here to here. A lot of nutrition in a short time. You'll notice that soybean is a lot of nutrition over a longer period of time. So not only do we need the nutrition, but we need it available very consistently. And that makes nutrient management hard for soybeans. Say we have a soil A, that can supply this much phosphorus per acre per day. Fertility gets you that gap to make sure we can get to that peak demand. But some of us are lucky and on soil B, or that year's mineralization and weathering is like soil B, turning soil A into soil B. In that case, the soil is supplying all the fertilizer or phosphorus that this crop would need. So when we're out there in the fields trying to look at it, and corn's pretty obvious with a lot of nutrient deficiencies. I mean, you could tell when it's deficient in nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus. Soybean has some similar trends where you can see it, but it's not always as easy to see. So how do you know if your crop is deficient? This is why people tissue test. This is where tissue testing has its role, to try and understand the soil as best we can, but it's unpredictable. Just go straight to the source. Check on the patient and say, how are you feeling today? Are you sufficient, deficient? And then we can maybe make a correction. Because the other advantage to soybean being so extended in its nutrient uptake, that means there's window of opportunity to supplement if you're coming short. And the idea of tissue testing is to provide the nutrient status of the leaf material, because as Dr. Bilo mentioned, most of the leaf assimilates go to fill the pods at that node. So if we know what's going on in the leaves, we can predict that will be going to the pods, and then that's how maybe we break the relationship, right? If we can ensure the nutrient status of the leaf is adequate, and you've set the number, that'll get us the seed weights, or make sure we don't abort pods as well. There are some challenges though. Out of curiosity, raising hands, how many people are tissue testing their soybean? Right? Good, we got some hands up. It's a little less than half, but it's a growing interest, and then you do talk to the high-yield growers, and what do they say? You got a tissue test, and then they don't necessarily tell you what you do after that, right? So they're really, really good at telling you how they did it without actually telling you anything. But what the standard recommendation is, right, for soybean, most recently mature trifoliate. I think, would nod of heads, people agree with that? Right? Well, I scratch my head and say, what does that mean exactly? How do you define mature trifoliate? Well, you got to look at the soil labs and the plant tissue testing labs. They all have different recommendations. Great resources on there. And if you have your lab, you know what they recommend, but are you looking what other labs are recommending? So WaterZag is an example. On their website, fully developed leaves at the top of the plant. That's how they describe where you should sample. A&L Great Lakes, we work very closely with them. Recently fully developed leaf without petiole. So there's at least a more specific example. We're not looking at petioles, we're looking at leaf material. Ward Labs, they have an initial phrase, 2 or 3 fully developed leaves at the top of the plant. They do go on to be a little more specific. Mature leaves are the 3rd or 4th set of trifoliates below the growing terminals, and the petioles should also be removed. So now we can at least start counting, right? So you go below the bud and you count down 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll take 3 and 4. That's what they would define as mature. Descriptions are often open to interpretation. Some of us are good at learning via audio or reading, but many of us are really better learning with visuals, right? Some of the labs, I'm happy to say, do have visuals for how you should tissue test soybean. So here's Midwest Laboratories, very artistic, and I apologize for those in the back, but they circle the trifoliate they're looking at, but if you look closely, there's 2 lines. One goes there, and one goes there. So it's artistic discretion. Which trifoliate or petiole are they saying that's coming from? Because based on that, it looks like one's at the top of the plant, but one might be in the middle of the plant. Here's another example, similar thing. I can see 2 clear lines coming from that dark spot where they're recommending. So it's a visual on where to recommend, but it's still a little vague. And then this is a generic for soybeans, snap beans, or peas that they say newest fully developed, and again, we're a 1/3 of the way down the plant. So while there are recommendations, I think there's a lot of variability in how people describe it. And I would say soybean tissue testing and which ones you pull is probably either A, in the eye of the beholder, or B, when you were an intern at some point and your agronomist you were working for said this is how you do it the rest of your life that way, because that's what you were taught. These bring some questions as to how consistent is tissue testing. Now, if you do sample, be sure you do it the same way every time. But if you have a couple of interns and you're trying to do multiple fields, are your interns all sampling the same way? Or when you get different results from different farms, is it because the interns are pulling from different spots? Things to consider when we are tissue testing. How do we sample tissue testing? Going to an actual soybean plant, we stripped everything from the bottom. So this was a V7, most open right here, right? This is still touching, so that's our 8th trifoliate. 1, 2, or 3, right? So 1's the youngest, 2 is that what I would say second youngest, 3 right here. Which one are you sampling? Are you on 1, the newest, 2, that looks pretty mature, or 3? And with the coloring, you can say these 2, this one's starting to wither a little bit, but color-wise, this is much darker. And we also typically know darker plants are usually healthier, better nutrient status. So is the paler one still not quite at full capacity? Most of us, I think, would select number 2, right? The crazy thing about this is you got 48 hours later and everything's changed. So that challenge there. But how we define most mature, I think, is still a little vague and open to interpretation. And there's still a lot to consider what might be the best strain things, and that's why we're working with the Illinois Soybean Association to go for that, to try and balance the interpretations and make sure the data is most useful to as many that are out there. We're sampling what would say 2 and 3 together. So we're getting the average of what many, I think, would pull, but if some are going, this fits more in that ward recommendation, right? So there's the bud, 1, 2, 3, 3, and 4 would be where their recommendation would be. So when I show you some data in a little bit, this is how we're doing it. We're taking these 2 and combining them to get the average somewhere in the middle on there. So as the crop grows, top of the plant though, that is the consistent thing. So we go out and sample. Maybe we're doing some really early samplings here. You know, we got early tissues, try and get some indication we could put out with the post. But as the crop grows, where do we keep sampling? At the top. We're always going back to the top of the plant. Now it's easy, because it's usually easy to see. They're usually nice, fluff, you know, no insect damage. They're easy to see with your eye. You go in, you pluck them, you walk down the row, you get enough, put them in the bag, good to go, right? So there's that benefit. But what about what's going on down here? There's a lot more leaf material, still green, below where we're sampling. Are we just assuming that those are done? There's nothing that we can do for those trifoliates and we can only fix what's above? Well, soybean has an interesting growth pattern. We say indeterminate growth for most of us here in Illinois. You are still flowering at the top, but developing pods at the bottom. And where this project came from, I had a discussion with a grower I was talking in Kentucky. And they said, when I do my nutrient applications, I've got overcovers, I've got undercovers. And should I change my nutrient management plan based on which parts of the canopy I'm going through at a given point in the season? And I said, that's a fantastic question. I got no idea. Let's go find out. So put the proposal together, started working on it, Illinois Soybean Association. But this is the exciting thing about soybean. It's doing 2 different things, and we're always focused on what's the newest. I should reiterate, why do we sample the top of the plant? It's the newest growth. And if you are deficient, you would think it would show up in the newest growth because that's where things are pulling from. And at the bottom, maybe we're done. And so is the top the best approach? It is important to still know what the future pods are going to need. Don't overlook the value of that tissue sampling. But are we limiting our yield by ignoring what's going on below? And is our yields not going up because we're losing it on the bottom half, even though we're watching it and managing it on the top half? All that comes together, a review of kind of confusions out there. How should we do it? What's the opportunity and strategy? And so working with Illinois Soybean Association Field Advisor, we've got some preliminary data from our first year. We're going to have a lot more data coming for this 2025. So the one thing I will say as we go through this, I do not promise to have all the answers today. And that's good because I still need to have a job, right? If we had all the answers, I'd be out of a job. And so excited, though, about what we are discovering, where we're going. So a little background on our approach and how it started. So started here at Champaign. We used, here's our standard soil test. Pretty good on the P and the K, I'd say, from our understandings of recommendations. Probably not going to be supplying fertility for this soybean crop, corn crop. We might be pushing it for a little bit, but good base, good solid sound start. A longer maturity variety. We want to extend the season, get good leaf health when we're doing leaf tissue samplings, and understand a little bit of that remobilization. Standard planting rate and wide rows, but we did go a little earlier, April 22nd. One of the questions about tissue testing is there's the soil supply that we talked about, but what if you fertilize and make sure you're already ahead of the game trying to minimize the potential deficiencies? So we looked at this in 2 ways. No fertility, that's soil supply, or we put out a full broadcast rate of NPK, sulfur, zinc, and boron at rates for targeted yield goals of 60 bushels, just to make sure we were trying to cover our bases. I will give you the yields right now. First of all, it was a pretty good year for us on this site. So soil supply was 85, and we did get about 7 bushel response to the fertility. Moving forward, though, I think many of us are maybe not fully fertilizing soybeans, so the interpretation of the soil test is, or the tissue test is, what's the soil providing? or not providing, and then quick correct for that. So making up for the soil letdown. So the rest of the inference will be to the unfertilized plots for today. Again, like I said, how we sampled it, this would be like a V7 trifoliates. If you count back, you got cotyledon node, your unifoliate node, and then you start counting. We took 6 and 7 together, so there's 6, there's 7. Now at this stage, that's the standard, the most recently mature for this timing. Where we changed it up, going back to the title, taking tissue testing to the whole plant level, here is a V11 plant, where we came in and we sampled trifoliates 11 and 10, but we also came back and pulled 8 and 9, and 6 and 7. And what's cool about this is we took 6 and 7 at the 7th V7 vegetative. We took 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 when we had 9 vegetative trifoliates out there, and we come back. And so we're constantly tracking what's the lower canopy doing over time as the upper canopy builds. And then I will just put a note, anything 5 or below, we didn't. There's some herbicide injury, and a lot of those drop off and don't put pods at all, or they branch. So we ignored the branches as well. We focused on the upper half of the stems. Love working with data. And even better is trying to summarize data in a way that we can all think on and move through. So this is going to be what we tend to avoid is common format, but what I want to explain how we design and sample. So what you have is which trifoliates we collected on that y-axis, and then you're going forward in time with the vegetative and then the reproductive status at the day we sample. One of the crazy things about early beans, they will flower before June 21st. So the reproductive phases here too, it changes traditionally, right? We think we had flowers, V7, and I think our first sampling was somewhere around June 11th or 12th. So just understanding that. But with tissue testing and tracking it, we focus on the trifoliates. And the other thing is we went every 2 growth stages by pairs. I know a lot of folks will go out every Monday, get the results by Wednesday, make an application, and then do it all over again. We wanted to track the same trifoliates because you're not guaranteed, maybe you got 1.5 growth stages in a week. This week it was 2. Really slow week, it was 1. So keeping in mind there, it wasn't on a consistent time basis. We tracked every 2 leaves to emerge to keep that consistent. What I will first show you is the biomass in that, what an acre furrow slice, right, on a soil test is. Thinking an acre furrow slice on that level of the canopy and how much nutrition is in that level of the leaf canopy. And this would be the biomass for the standard recommended timings. So if you got a V7 plant, you're taking those top 2 nodes. You got a V9 plant, you're taking the top 2 nodes at that stage, and so on and so forth. This would be what would be standard recommendation in the data. And we actually weigh these and then calculate the biomass per acre. The interesting thing is the top of the plant, between that 9th to 17th or so trifoliate, it's basically the same size. So during the majority of the season, the trifoliates themselves stay consistent. They're not getting bigger in certain parts of the plants or smaller. Obviously our early season and our late season growth, we know those top trifoliates will never be as big. So that was an interesting finding. So when we think about comparing tissue tests from sampling to sampling, the biomass stays consistent. But what happens when we go back about 10 days later? There's the biomass of those same trifoliates, but at the next sampling, and they all increased. Now, does this mean they all got bigger in surface area, or maybe it's leaf thickness? They're just getting thicker. But our most recently mature, 10 days later, are still getting mature. So it also comes back to defining maturity. Is it based on how open those trifoliates are, how dark they are, or when they reach peak mass before they start to remobilize? And so in every single case, we actually had biomass accumulation continuing, and these would be the 4th or 5th trifoliates below the newest bud. So you go to the bud and start counting back. Would be peak biomass, and is that how we should define most mature? And I'll use this example. Again, the standard test should say we're pulling the red circles, but based on peak biomass, that didn't happen till 4th and 5th down. So do we need to thinking, should we be sampling a node or 2 lower to get the peak biomass and development of that trifoliate? If you take it out even further, there's some interesting trends. It would suggest that the bottom half of the canopy is starting to then get smaller, starting to remobilize to those pods. The upper part of the canopy in a few spots continues to grow. So there's a spatial difference in how the trifoliates go. And on this data, it looks like the lower canopy loses its biomass a little quicker, and the upper canopy still goes. Makes sense though, right? As soon as it starts to shade out, we know those lower leaves start to wither, drop, and go fast. The upper leaves are still going. So that's the dynamic of canopy sunlight interpretation. But the tissue test would say do the same way no matter what stage you're at. Questionable there. This is if you do it all out, right? So there's no data up in this corner because eventually those 6th and 7th trifoliates are no longer there. And then obviously there's no data here until you have those nodes developed. This is circling at what time a certain set of nodes did peak in biomass. And so 1 year data, like I said, a little bit, trends, it's not perfect, but what it does suggest is that the lower canopy is maturing more quickly, i.e. 14 days, and then it goes downhill. And the upper canopy might go 21 days before it's fully developed and starts to remobilize. So there's different spatial implications there. And why this is important to have this discussion. Tissue test is a nutrient status of leaf material. How many of you, though, weigh the tissues and compare that to the tissue test? Because a large biomass can have a low concentration because the nutrients are distributed over a bigger area. A small biomass can have a high concentration. We did our high yield Quest studies a couple years ago, and our all-in 500 bushel Quest corn had lower soil tissue tests than our standard because the things were twice as big. But if you did the uptake and actual nutrition in the plant, it was higher. So this is why tissue test also has some variability because the biomass changes the results as well, and that's why it's important to maybe try and collect both. So then, though, these are the values most of us probably familiar with. They range. These are from A&L. That's the same lab that's running our samples, and so we wanted to go off their standards. The first thing you'll notice on the macros, there's quite a range there, and they change it slightly based on stage, but that's quite a range, and it's even more of a range on the micros. I mean, boron, for example, that's a 3-fold difference in the lower to upper threshold. So if my tissue test for boron is 25 on one day and 55 on the next day, is that still sufficient? Who's setting the standards? Where are those data coming from? Is it outdated? Is that for 40 bushel beans, and now we have 80 bushel beans? We need to update this. So again, these are what the commercial lab levels are, but it's what we can use as a reference in our data set. So here are the nitrogen concentrations for all those trifoliates and all those times. And there's a few key trends going on here. If you look within one set of node and go left to right within a row, it gets less. Every time. That row gets less from left to right, left to right. So left to right, nitrogen decreases. Left to right is time. Time from when that trifoliate first emerged to when it eventually withers off and has been remobilized and falls off. I don't think this is shocking, right? It's putting data to stuff we see in the field. Over time, the leaves get deficient and move that to the pods. What's also interesting, and again, not really, I would say, groundbreaking, if you go from top to bottom, i.e. newest trifoliates to oldest trifoliates, the concentrations also decrease. New growth is where we're putting most of our nutrition. Old growth, we don't really as interested anymore from the plant perspective, or it's remobilizing it. So these are key trends that just has the data, backs it up, makes sense to what we see. So newer trifoliates have higher nutrient concentrations as the lower nodes have started to remobilize. And then the interesting thing, though, is here is what would all be considered sufficient. And I use a cutoff of 4. So from a nitrogen perspective, we were probably good the whole season long. Nitrogen wasn't limiting in this case. However, going back to biomass, if you multiply this concentration times this biomass, you actually get the amount of nutrient in the leaf material. And they almost all peak right at the front. So the tissue test says sufficient, but very clearly we are moving nitrogen somewhere else on an uptake basis. So maybe, again, the critical levels aren't maybe adapted to today's yield levels. So tissue test sufficient, yet nitrogen is moving left to right through time. It's leaving the leaves. Why this makes sense, nitrogen uptake is season long, and a lot of it goes away from the green into the blue, remobilization. Phosphorus, this is interesting. Phosphorus, we were basically sufficient every time we did the most mature, but the next sampling, all our lower trifoliates were deficient. And so phosphorus is moving very fast out of the trifoliates. And phosphorus, why is that going on? 80% of phosphorus does end up in the grain. And so as soon as it's in the leaf material, maybe it's thinking, I got to go to those pods, and phosphorus might move a little more quickly than nitrogen. Sulfur is an interesting case. We get a lot of things on there, right? So sulfur also goes to the grain. Should it act like phosphorus? Well, if you look at the trends, the lower canopy moves sulfur out of leaves fast. The upper canopy tends to build it, and then, or middle canopy, I should say, builds sulfur, then removes it, and the upper canopy holds on to it. So now we have very clear different patterns in N, P, and sulfur. But we're still recommending to sample the same leaves for all nutrients every time. I would challenge that, and that's what this project is focused on doing, and eventually it does go down. So sulfur levels change over time and is canopy position dependent. Boron, I'll just cut to the chase on boron. There's the leaf test and the uptake accumulation. It's more or less steady. A lot of these values don't change, right? They dip a little bit here and there, but you don't really see much boron leaving the leaves because boron doesn't leave the leaves, right? It's season-long uptake, but once it's taken up, once it ends up where it goes, it stays there. So also understanding boron in the leaf tissue test may not be as useful for a grain perspective because it doesn't end up moving from that grain point. And so soybean doesn't remobilize the boron. Different thing there. So really excited to just bring what we're starting to learn, like I said, still have some answers yet to get to, like I said, keeping us in business. But what we're tending to see is the newer leaves certainly have higher nutrient concentrations than the older. The lower canopy maybe matures a little more quickly, and that trifoliate selection probably is going to depend on where we're at in the crop. And for the nutrition, it's different based on which nutrient. Certain nutrients move faster than others, and it's spatially dependent. Probably have a lot yet to go to optimize nutrient management in soybean. And maybe 0.4 bushels per acre can become 0.6, 0.8 bushels per acre per year on that increase. However, last question I get. So what's your recommendation based on current tissue guidelines from the labs today? Well, innocent until proven guilty. We haven't nailed it yet. Current recommendation would still stand. However, maybe go one trifoliate lower and see if that gives you some better results and responses. Do some comparisons side by side. What you typically do, going one lower, change the recommendations if you're doing foliar, and really consider where you're pulling from. So thank you very much. Field advisor for this event, Illinois Soybean Association for the project, the sponsor, and the opportunity. I know I'm right up on time, but I'm not running away, so I'll be around for the break. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Connor. 10:30, we've been sitting for a while, so we're going to take a 15-minute break. Coffee, soda, water over there. Make sure you sign up for CEU credits. Be sure to stop at the field advisor table. Make sure you get your swag and anything else you need. We'll come back here and start at 10:45. 5 minutes. We'll get started again in 5 minutes, folks.
I'm not going to hold that. So, I'm just going to have to go with this.
All right, folks, if you could return to your seat, please, we'll get started again. You ready? There we go. All right, we are ready for our next presentation. We'll invite Dr. Scott Irwin to the stage. He is the Laurence J. Norton Chair of Agricultural Marketing at the University of Illinois and is a globally recognized leader in ag economics. He's written extensively on commodity markets and is best known for his work on market speculation and biofuel policy. His expertise has earned him invitations to testify before Congress as well as OECD. He's a fellow of the Agricultural Applied Economics Association, the organization's highest honor, and has received numerous awards for his research, extension, and policy contributions. Got his bachelor's from Iowa State. They beat Bill Self last night. A master's and PhD from Purdue in Ag Econ. In addition to his research, he teaches courses on commodity price analysis. So please welcome Dr. Scott Irwin.
All right. Thank you, DeLoss. I really appreciate that. Just a sound check. Everybody hearing me fine out there? Great. Delighted to be here. Thank you to the Illinois Soybean Association for the invitation to be here today. If you've heard me speak before, you'll know that I sound a little bit different today. I'm a proud grandparent of 4 children, but we had a party for my 1-year-old granddaughter on Saturday, and I got a gift of a cold. So those of you that are grandparents know that sometimes your shields go down, and mine was, and you can't resist them. So I might have to take a break or two for some water. And I guess my job this morning is kind of to bring you guys all back down to reality after all the excitement from Dr. Bilo and in his presentation. So, you know, they don't call economics the dismal science for anything. And so just get ready. No, it's really not that bad. Okay, we're going to start at a really high level in my remarks in the next 20, 25 minutes. I want to leave some time for questions. This chart shows U.S. net farm income for the last 25 years in nominal terms. And a couple things that I really want you to notice. One, look at how high farm income was from 2020 through 2022, peaking in 2022 at over $180 billion. The average is just under, I think, read my notes, $89 billion. So we had an extraordinary period of high incomes in the farm sector. The second thing to note is how fast we're coming down from the peak. The latest projections on this chart for 2024 are down to around $140 billion, a drop of about $40 billion. So it's kind of a sudden reversal. That's the second thing to notice. But it's also important for perspective, and that's why I show this chart, that the sector still has experienced overall income that is way above average, which is kind of interesting compared to some of the headlines you see. But if you dig down behind that, what we've seen is kind of an unusual divergence in the fortunes of the crop sector compared to the livestock sector. And so the livestock sector is doing better than the crop sector. But since much of Illinois agriculture in particular is focused on the crop sector, that's going to be where we'll find a lot of the negative news. So that's just kind of the broad picture as we look at the outlook for Illinois and Corn Belt agriculture. Now I'm going to go into kind of, okay, where might we be headed from here? And just a couple quick charts to show you. It is and it isn't that complicated, because this chart just lays on top of net farm income the Illinois price of corn. If you know where the price of corn is going, you have about a 2/3 chance of predicting where U.S. net farm income is going. And since corn and soybean prices are so highly correlated over time, it's about the same message for soybean. So if you know where corn and soybean prices are headed, then you pretty much know where farm income in the U.S. is headed in general. So I want to share with you how I think about corn, soybeans, and wheat prices. This is my basic template for these crucial markets and how I think about them kind of at a 50,000-foot level. The chart I'm showing you right now shows the monthly average price of corn in Illinois going all the way back to post-World War II, back to 1947. Okay? And there were pretty much two obvious eras, one in the 40s through the early 70s, when the average price of corn was $1, I got to read my notes here, $1.28, since I can't see the screen very well, and then it was $2.43 from the basically 1973 through 2006. Okay? This was the data that my good friend and colleague, Darrell Good, and I had in front of us in the summer of 2008. That's why I show this data this way without all of our recent data. And we all know that grain prices had exploded in 2007, 2008, and so we were getting flooded with questions about, is this just a temporary spike? Or is this going to be a permanent increase in the average price level like we saw in the early 70s? So Darrell and I did what you should never do as an economist. We really stuck our necks out, and we made long-term price projections based on our perception of number one thing, was that the ethanol-driven boom in grain prices was real, and that the ethanol boom was powering a permanent increase in the average price of corn. And without going into the details of how we did it, the chart shows that we forecast that average to be $4.60 a bushel. Again, and remember, this was in the summer of 2008 when we made that $4.60 per bushel average price projection. So now, 17 years later, and that's the advantage of having a long career, you can actually go back and test how well you did some of these things. So 17 years later, how did we do? Came within 2 cents. In the last 17 years, the average price of corn in Illinois has been $4.58. So I should just drop the mic, exit the stage. I will never make another forecast that's that good the rest of my career. I guarantee it. But actually, equally important in our projections, we also forecast the range of prices based on historical volatility of corn prices, and we captured that pretty well. It was interesting when Darrell and I put out these projections initially, we came to the conclusion that we'd actually gotten it about right because no one agreed with us. You know, I know this is mainly an audience of people in, you know, the agronomic fields, but that's really how you can judge things as an economist if you get it about right, if no one thinks you're right. In 2008, we had the optimist who said, oh my gosh, $4.60 when prices were $6 or $7 a bushel, that is, you know, you're way too low. On the other side, you had the pessimist who were thinking of $2.40 corn saying, oh my gosh, you're dramatically way too high. And that was pretty much the reactions that we got. And we said, nope, we're going to stick with $4.60. We were stubborn. But most importantly, we said, look at the huge range of prices that you should expect. And we said we thought about $3 would catch it on the downside, and then something like $7 or $8 on the high side. That turned out to be also equally true, and that is the trading range that we have been in for the last 17 years, and right now I don't see any reason to change that as an expectation until something really dramatic happens again in terms of a new form of demand. So that's corn. And since this was a corn ethanol-driven boom, we started with the price of corn, and then we priced soybeans and wheat relative to the price of corn. And we were a little bit low on beans. We had predicted a price of $11.04, and the price turned out to be $11.30. So we came pretty close on soybeans. We were just a little bit too low on soybeans, but again, we were a little too high on the high, but again, the low was also important. So basically, $4.60 corn, a little higher than $11 beans was what we predicted, and that's exactly what we've gotten. Wheat, not as important in Illinois, but we predicted that price to be $5.80, and it came out to be $5.71. So again, pretty close. So as we're thinking about where the sector is going to go in the long run, those are the numbers that I use. Those are planning values, obviously with a huge amount of volatility. So that was kind of the second step that I wanted to share with you. Start with the broadest measure of sectoral income. Grain prices are crucial, and this is how I think about grain prices. Next, you know, if you look at, in particular, if you go to corn prices, stepping back a bit, you can see we're currently clearly below the long-term average. And we have been below the long-term average for a little bit less than a year. So what can we say about what might happen moving forward from here? We're sitting below average. And so this is the analysis that I've done that's relative to that question. So what I've done now is I've drilled down in the data here on corn prices. I'll show soybean prices in a minute. In this new era, the last 17 years that started in late 2006, okay? So that's all you see there, okay? The new era of corn prices. And now what I am marking out for you is the length of time that we've been below average and above average in all of these different swings the last 17 years, above and below average in the corn market. And what you can see is a lot of range in those numbers, from as short as 8 months above to, I think that's 80 months below the average. So there's a lot of range in the time that you can spend above and below average. But that's the history that we have available to us. And as I show here, the average amount of time that we have been above average is, I believe it's 25 or 26 months, and the average below is 42 months. So that's the data that we have. 42 months, you can think of it as around a little more than 3 years. So kind of some round numbers to help remember is that our typical behavior is around 2 years above average and around 3 years, maybe a little bit longer, below average. So if we've been just a little bit under 1 year below average in corn, history would suggest we'd probably have at least another couple years below average. And that's just kind of a typical cycling of prices that we see in this sector. And it helps us to get perspective on what I think is the critical question facing the sector, which is grain prices, how low, how long? And that is, I think, the best answer that we can give from the available history of prices. That, again, it's important to remember that these periods of lower prices, they don't last forever. Probably the thing that is most concerning when people ask me questions is, we want to avoid that 80-month swing that we had from basically 2013 to August 2020. That's a long time below average. But that's also very, very unusual if you go back the last 50 years to see it like that. So that's what it looks like for corn. That's what it looks like for soybeans. Pretty much the same kind of picture from soybeans. The swings are a little bit more evenly distributed in terms of time for soybeans, but still roughly that kind of 2 years above, 3 years below is the average. But again, there's some variation in that over time as well. So with that background on grain prices, what I want to do is now move and talk about kind of continuing to telescope down, and I want to talk about the evolution of returns to corn and soybean production here in the Corn Belt. And this is great data that Gary Schnittke, Nick Paulson, and colleagues here on the Farm Doc team at the University of Illinois produce. This is their latest data on the per acre returns, net returns to a farmer on a 50-50 basis after cash rent, okay? After cash rent. So some things I want you to look at. There's obviously a lot of variation. Prices are doing this. Yields are doing this. Net returns are going to be volatile. First thing to notice is that the average, after paying all costs, including cash rent, the net return to the farm operator averages really close to $100 an acre. When you just kind of squeeze everything out of the sector, account for everything, Illinois farmers, in the long run, are willing to farm for $100 an acre. That's the return to their management and labor that they provide to the operations. If you can do better than $100 an acre, then you will rapidly increase the size of your farm operation. So that's the key. That's the benchmark. So now look at what the sector experienced in 2020 through 22. I didn't think we were ever going to see, at least for a long, long time, returns to corn and soybean production that beat some of those that we saw in 07 through 12. But 2022 did. In those 3 years, we averaged a return of $240 an acre on a 50-50 basis. Almost 2.5 times normal. So that's really important as we think about moving into thinking about the financial prospects of the sector, is the tremendous profits that the sector experienced in 2020, 21, and 22. The total net return during that period was $688 per acre. Again, remember, that's after, in this data, paying average cash rents, according to the FBFM data. For example, in 2024, I believe that was $359 an acre, is the cash rent figure that they use. Okay, big profits through 2022. And you can see then, wow, a lot of red for 2023, 24, and the projections for 2025. Basically, if you add those up, we're giving back about 40% of the profits from 2020, 21, and 22. That's the bottom line. It's an unprecedented period of losses that you can see in 2023, $93, 2024, current projections are $91 loss, and 2025, $58 loss projection. Actually, if you can imagine it, the 2024 projection looks a lot better than it did last summer when the price of corn was below $4 and we didn't know that we were going to get some of the big yields that we got. So it's a little bit better that way. So clearly we are in a period of substantial losses. Maybe even a bit surprising how big they are. How did we get there? And that's what I want to show with this chart. This shows the change on the revenue and cost side from 2019 to 2024 for that 5-year period. What's interesting is gross revenue on a combined 50-50 corn soybean basis is actually way up over the last 5 years. It is up almost $150 an acre. So revenue has not gone down. But the issue is how rapidly costs have escalated. You can just go through the categories. Direct costs are seed, seed, fertilizer, et cetera. That's up about $75 an acre. Power costs a little under $50. Overhead costs a little under $50, about $40. Total non-land cost over $150 up. Land cost, which is cash rent, is up about $80 an acre. So you can see all costs, including cash rent, are up over $250 an acre, and with gross revenue up under $150 an acre, we see the farmer return has dropped by over $100 an acre. So right now, I would describe the situation of Corn Belt agriculture. We have a cost problem right now. The cost structure that has gotten leveraged into the sector during the boom years is not sustainable in our current down cycle for grain prices. Now, the question is, again, that's why I say the key question for the sector is grain prices, how low, how long? Because you can withstand these losses and you can absorb them out of the liquidity built up during the boom years, but only if the losses don't persist for too many years, for too long. And so that's why how low, how long is a critical question as we move forward. Key aspect of thinking about the financial situation moving forward, what happens in Washington, D.C.? And probably you're all already aware of this. In the political battle over funding the federal government right before Christmas, crop farmers got a very nice $10 billion Christmas present from the U.S. federal government. As a side note, to me, I found it fascinating that, in essence, we don't really have a lot of financial stress in Corn Belt agriculture yet, but the mere projection of it, like I'm showing here, resulted in this nice $10 billion gift. And again, Gary Schnicke and colleagues have done great work outlining the size of these one-time payments, okay? They're not connected to any Farm Bill programs. It's just a one-time, ad hoc, low-return payment that's going to result in some pretty nice-sized checks. There are some payment limitations on them. If I remember the numbers right, $42 an acre on corn, and I cannot read that. I think it's around $30 an acre for soybeans. So 40 and 30, roughly. Those checks will be coming out sometime in the next few months in 2025 for the 2024 crop. So this is what the revised 50-50 returns look like. So we were at minus 91. That raises that to minus 54. So those checks are going to be nice, and they're going to offset a chunk, but basically all they're going to do on average cash rent land is offset some of the losses. It's not going to push us into profitability unless you have much lower cash rent rates and so on. There'll be individual situations where that can be the case, but it's important to keep that in perspective. But we can see that, you know, losses projected right now for 2025. Anybody want to guess? You know, most people in here, I guess, have raised kids, and once you have demonstrated that you're willing to do this once, what do you think the chance is that the federal government might be willing to do this a second time? You know, I wouldn't count on it, but it wouldn't surprise me if it happened either. Okay, before I finish, I want to go through, where's the loss? How am I doing on time? 5 minutes. I will see your 5 minutes and raise you 1 minute. No, I'm just kidding. Talk a little bit about land prices. I mean, we've seen tremendous increase in land prices over time. In this latest boom period, we have seen land prices go up basically a third. And the latest auctions, the data that I've seen, there's variability, but land seems to be pretty much holding its own right now. Here's the way that I like to think about land prices. So the red line is simply the return on holding 10-year Treasury bonds. That's the red line. Think of that as the required return in the land market. That's your target, is the red line. And notice that that's come down a lot in the last 45 years. And after the financial crisis and COVID, it got down to 1 or 2%. But with our newfound policy of fighting inflation, it has driven interest rates up over 4%, at least on this 10-year Treasury note basis. And that yield has continued to climb. So, with respect to land prices, the current return on land is the blue. It's just rent divided by land price. And over time, that ratio basically tracks the required rate of return. It ain't rocket science. Where we are now is that the required rate of return's been going up, and the current return is getting pressured on farmland. So I'm not projecting any disaster in the land market, but it's very hard for me to see how we're going to see further appreciation, at least for a while, in the land market from the levels that we had seen in recent years. Wouldn't surprise me if we end up, you know, driving land prices back maybe 5–10% during this time period. Okay. A little bit now about really short run, where are we headed in the grain markets. This shows the WASDE balance sheets and then my personal balance sheet for 2025-26. So on the corn balance sheet, the USDA gave us a big surprise last Friday when they said that the corn yield was 3.8 bushels an acre less than they said it was in November. We could have a very nice debate about the accuracy of what that was and what it means, but I don't really have time to get into it. I'm looking for a bump up in corn acres, and I'm going to stick with a trend yield of a little under 184 bushels an acre, giving us a production of 15.4 billion, total supply of 17 billion bushels, total usage about 15 billion bushels, which would give us a ending stocks of a little under 1 billion bushels and a stocks-to-use ratio of 12.9. And it's hard to see on that slide, but a price of $4 a bushel. That's where I see the corn market right now. Soybeans, less acres this year, got a trend yield a little under 52 bushels an acre, total supplies of 4.8 billion, total usage of 4.3 billion, see us building stocks back up to above 400 million. Not nearly as severe of a situation as I had feared a few months ago, and I've got us at a price of $10 a bushel for the next year. So 4 and 10 is what I'm looking for, a continuation in the 2025 crop of prices below those long-term averages, given the fundamental situation. So now I'm going to talk about things that keep me awake at night, looking at the economics of this sector. One is the potential huge supply of coming out of South America. The Brazilian soybean crop looks like it could be a monster, and so that could really weigh on prices moving forward. But this is what really keeps me awake at night. We've got a new administration coming in. President Trump has loudly proclaimed his intention to impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico on everything, and an additional 10% tariff on goods from China. The one thing that I learned thinking about the economic implications of President Trump is in Trump 1.0, when he makes a pronouncement on economic policy, you'd better take him seriously. So I'm taking him serious that this could happen on Monday when he is inaugurated. It could be an executive order that quick. And we have some history about what happens if these countries retaliate. Who's our #1 buyer of corn by a big margin? Who knows? Mexico. You know, this is the danger of this policy, is what economists call the tit-for-tat retaliation. And it happened in 2017 and 18 with China. And so on this chart, I show Brazil and US price for soybeans. And when the trade war began, you see, normally our prices for Brazil and the US move very closely together in the export market. But when the first time we put the tariffs on China and China retaliated on soybeans, a $2.50 a bushel gap opened up between Brazil and US prices. Basically, China took their business to Brazil. What people, I think, on that episode, a lot of people kind of downplay that experience because it honestly didn't last that long. The worst of that was only about 6 or 8 months. The reason is the second thing I put on the chart. Coincidentally, China went through the worst commercial livestock disaster from disease in, I think, the history of mankind, with the swine flu in China. Just decimated their herds, so their demand went down from Brazil and prices came back together. Unless China gets a new swine flu disease, that's not going to bail us out this time. So I'm probably a lot more nervous about this than anything else as we move forward, but we're going to know a lot more, I think, in a week or two. So I don't have time on that. There, if you want to know more, I have a website, scottirwin.com, where you can post nasty comments about me if you want, my forecast, and I wrote a book. So that's it, DeLoss. Thank you very much. I'm a little over, but I can take a few questions if you want.
We need to get the 1 or 2. Okay, it's your panel next, so if you say 1 or 2. 1 or 2 for Scott?
Oh, I must have depressed them.
There's one right in the middle.
Yes, sir.
Editorial question maybe, but so I agree with your comments about the tariffs and its effect and the concern, but agriculture, at least my perception is, overwhelmingly supported Trump. Can you explain that dichotomy?
So the question was about tariffs' effect on agriculture, and yet agriculture in general supporting Trump.
Well, I would say from a political economic standpoint, you know, everybody weighs different issues in their importance when they decide to vote. And so, you know, agriculture weighed things and overwhelmingly went for Trump. But I'd like to, all fall, I've described talking to farmers that I know, because my family still farms in Iowa and a lot of connections there and here in Illinois. I said, farmers were as nervous as a cat on a hot tin roof pulling the lever for Trump. That's my description. They all knew this could be coming down the pike. But I will say this. I think the $10 billion package shows that there's likely to be a significant degree of what I call indemnification. If this happens again, and it looks likely to me, I think there'll be at least some significant efforts to backfill on the price, like we saw last time with trade payments. At least I'm hopeful. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but that's the way I think about it. Thank you.
All right.
All right.
It's gone. Thank you very much.
All right.
All right. Appreciate your comments. There, I'd use that one. We need to bring up a little bit of furniture. While we do that, also, I'd like to bring to the podium probably 1,200 certified crop advisors in Illinois. She's definitely in my top 7. That's not bad. That's a good ratio. Okay, one of my favorites, inside and outside of soybeans, Stephanie Porter, certified crop advisor and outreach agronomist for the Illinois Soybean Association. She will introduce our upcoming panel.
All right, so we'll get started. My name is Stephanie Porter, and I'm outreach agronomist on the Illinois Soybean Agronomy team. Welcome. This is our first ever Field Advisor Forum here at Memorial Stadium. And for sake of time, I'm not going to read off. Poor Kelsey did a whole, we have bios here of everybody. I think you're pretty well familiar of this group. We have certified crop advisors here. We are all certified crop advisors. The other main thing that I wanted when I gathered this panel was people that weren't afraid to speak their mind. And oftentimes throughout the year, I hear from these people, whether or not they are upset with something that they've heard or said or video or piece of marketing that they've heard within agronomy. And what it comes down to is sometimes, this phrase was mentioned, just because somebody is on social media or does a TikTok or does a tweet, or should I say X, does not mean that it's the truth. And so this has become something that a lot of my colleagues have become pretty upset about. I'm in a lot of agronomy groups within the industry across the U.S., and I'm constantly getting sent these videos and saying, are you serious? Or words that I probably shouldn't say up here on the stage. And with that, I also want to point out that these individuals here up on this stage are from different areas of the state. That is a big deal too, because we know Illinois is not just central Illinois where we are located now. We have the northern part, which Kyle, you can represent us up as well as, and can you represent northern Illinois for us?
I mean, my wife's from Naperville. So.
Okay, that counts. And we have Kelly from the south. And so a lot of these individuals, you may hear or know them from, whether it be TikTok, podcasts. We have Kelly, who's steered away from social media after a while because he couldn't take it anymore. But all different ages, age groups up here, all different backgrounds. We almost all went to different schools. And so just take that in consideration when we're going through and talking. So I just want to take a couple of moments for each of you to kind of do a quick introduction of yourself and tell us what it means to be an independent agronomist. To you, Kelly, go on.
Oh, I got to go first?
Sure.
Oh, okay. I'm Kelly Robertson. I'm from Benton, Illinois, which is south of Louisville, Kentucky. That's how far south we are in Illinois. Win a lot of bets with that one. 36 years as an independent crop consultant. Farmer, was a Pioneer seed dealer for a while and also with their Encirca granular program for a short time. Being independent means that I'm not representing a product or selling anything, and I see my job, and I've always seen my job as to promote the prosperity of my customers and the profitability of my customers, and that means to give them unbiased information, which means to tell them the truth and call BS when you see BS.
Thank you.
I'm Kyle Stull. I'm from Wisconsin. Actually, originally Indiana, so that's why I went to Purdue. So the Illinois thing's weird to me, but.
He had to make sure and say Purdue.
I worked in ag retail for, 15 years almost, and then quit to farm and be a Pioneer dealer. Didn't really plan on being an independent consultant. And then the farming thing just didn't work out. We'll just put it that way. The easiest way to put it is that. But then I ended up going into the seed dealership side and then doing some consulting. Eventually got out of seed. And honestly, I like working with my guys. My guys love that I do TikTok, so they're all ticked off right now. But yeah, I just kind of voice opinions, but my opinions are my opinions. It's fine. It doesn't have to mean that anybody has to agree with them. So.
Thank you. Karen.
I'm Karen Corrigan, and I've been an independent agronomist for over 20 years with McGillicuddy Corrigan Agronomics. So I work with growers from North Dakota to Tennessee and Indiana to Iowa. I guess for me, when we first started was kind of when all of our local crop educators and extension were being let go. And so we really filled that void of an independent voice. To me, it doesn't matter what you buy, as long as, I'll just tell you what will help you, but it's still your money, so you still have to make that decision. So I just hope to give you information to help you make a better decision.
So we met briefly just to kind of coordinate about today. And I said, can you give me a couple topics that you want to talk about? Well, the floodgates just opened. So we are going to just touch on a few of those topics, those hot button topics that get us going today really quickly, because I know you may have questions today. But let's each go ahead, each of you touch on a few topics, and I'm going to go with biologicals first. So this is something we get a lot of questions on. I just also want to plug, and I don't want to get in trouble from Lauren or Kelsey to not plug the Field Advisor webinar coming up. It's on January 22nd on biologicals, and you can find out more about it on fieldadvisor.com. But let's go through here. What are your comments, thoughts, feelings on biologicals? Kelly, you start.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a lot of snake oil and foo-foo juice being sold in the name of cutting inputs. Most of the people out here selling this junk don't have reliable, replicated research from sources. It's highly questionable what it does, what it doesn't do. My first advice to anybody that calls me is, if they can't tell you what's in the jug, don't buy it. And if you do buy some, just buy enough to try it, because there's no research or anything that shows that any of this stuff works.
Honestly, my opinion is always that we wish all those products worked. I mean, I tell that to everybody on TikTok. I wish those products all worked, but they possibly can't. There's no way that statistically every single product they're trying to sell you will work. It's just not going to happen.
I would just remind you that in a teaspoon of soil, there's over 1 billion organisms, and if you're putting a Coke can across 1 acre, how much of an effect are you really going to have? So I definitely would look for something that's proven. Second thing I would do is make sure you don't kill it before you put it on the field, because it's supposed to be living in the jug, and you're supposed to keep it that way before you apply it. So those are just some things to think about.
Okay. Next topic, round robin, is foliar feed, micronutrients. Kelly, you start.
I thought it was a round robin.
I'll start.
I'm circle, square, whatever.
You want me to start? I'll start.
Go ahead.
So I worked for Winfield Co-op for 3 years, and we really were taught the soils or tissue sample at V4 on corn. And you know why we were taught that? V4 on corn is when boron and zinc are deficient. And you know what Winfield sells? Max N ZMB, zinc, manganese, boron. So you just have to be careful on timing and what products you're using, and look at some of those labels on some of those micronutrients. I mean, just the amount of nutrient that's in that jug is next to nothing sometimes. I mean, there's 5% chelated manganese products. There's another product that has 0.3% in it. Just look at what's in the jug.
Karen.
The more things in the jug, the less of each there is. Mm-hmm. And if that isn't your yield limiting factor, what's in that jug is not going to help you. So if that's not your problem, then the product's not going to do you any good.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue I have with tissue testing and micronutrients is that there's no soil sample taken when the tissue samples are taken, and so what we run into in Southern Illinois is that probably 40% of the time a tissue test that shows a deficiency, if a soil test is taken at the same time, also shows a pH problem, and so you're not taking up what's there anyway because it's not available. And when you're paying $16 an acre for 0.33 pounds of fertilizer, I have a real problem with that, especially when it's not going to make any difference in yield.
You could pee on it for a lot cheaper.
What's that?
You could pee on it for a lot
Oh,
cheaper.
yeah.
Just saying.
A good-sized St. Bernard can change the crop, It's just, I don't know, it's comical to me in some ways.
Okay. Here's another one of my favorites. And I heard it not too long ago in a conversation that we had with a farmer that may be doing a on-farm trial with us in our on-farm trialing system at ISA. So sugar, humic acid. Karen.
Well, first of all, if you know much about sugar production, it's a cartel. And if you look at sugar, using sugar with your herbicides, that's more of a cult. So I guess that's my opinion.
I think Sean Connolly said it best. His last research paper he had on sugar was a spoonful of sugar helps the profits go down.
Yeah, he did say that.
I've got one customer that uses sugar, and it's in specialty crop production. And it's not for enhanced yield or anything else. It's for control of aphids. And we have actually seen in pumpkin production that we can eliminate some of the pesticide by the sugar. As far as any yield increase or anything, or doing anything for the plant, it's not happening. I agree with Karen, it's a cult.
Okay, so one more I have on my notes are, what are your pet peeves? I know a lot of people are doing cover crops, buzzwords, soil health. Give us your thoughts on those.
What's your definition of soil health?
Yeah.
It's incredibly hard to give any real good opinions on what soil health is, because it's different to every single other person.
And around the world.
Yeah, and it seems like the more we look at some of the cover crop stuff, it just really depends on what region of the country you're in, what your Haney test says on the specific day you took it, because those Haney tests can be different from day to day, just like tissue samples can on corn. I mean, it's just, what is soil health is so different, and it's so hard to define it that it can be anything to anybody.
I think the cover crop thing is probably the thing that is my biggest pet peeve, in the sense that cover crops are sold as the cure-all. I mean, it'll make you smarter, richer, make your wife better looking, get your kids a degree. And the things that are promised through cover crops are not really real or obtainable. And unfortunately, the programs that are out there to promote cover crops and whatnot have done farmers a great disservice. In my county, we've got a grant to promote cover crops and whatnot. And so what we're doing is we're setting farmers up to fail with cover crops because we're not doing any training, we're not doing any realistic expectations, and we're not teaching them how to terminate those cover crops and plant into them. And John Pike and I have discussed this. I mean, the benefits of cover crop are real. What we're doing to promote them is absolutely wrong, and the moral superiority that a lot of the cover crop community have, that they're doing it to those that aren't. And until we get this stuff to where we can apply it over thousands of acres at one time, it's absolutely useless.
I guess I'm going to go a little different aspect. I think one of our problems is that we all have problems with our neighbors all have problems controlling their weeds. So I think we need to really look at the fact that we need more non-chemical controls, and cover crops can be helpful if you use them correctly. But in order to do that, you have to let them basically be a mulch crop. So you have to let them get tall enough before you crimp them over or kill them in order for them to shade the soil. That works in years where we have a good moisture, not so great if we end up short on moisture. So there's a much higher level of management, but as far as helping us with weed control, I think that's one aspect that we need to look at.
Yeah, and Wisconsin talks about that all the time, and it's more in soybeans than it is in corn, just because of that carbon to nitrogen penalty that we got to deal with.
I also think on the soil health side of it too is that we focus on all the Haney test and whatnot, and a lot of times the first thing, again, coming from the south, a little probably different perspective than what you guys all have north of I-70, but I mean pH. If your pH isn't right, I don't know why you're worried about soil health. Your soil's not going to be healthy to start with. So, fix the basics first.
Okay, so basically, what I heard you guys say when we talked was that, I heard this phrase, and so I would like you all to comment on it, and I feel very strongly about this as well some days, but the death of the common sense agronomist or agronomy. How did we get here? I know can we blame it on social media? And what can we do about it?
I think it happened well before social media. I mean, it started, all the companies, if you're old enough to remember, they had salespeople and they had technical agronomists. And at some point, that became the same position. And what was expected of them was more the sales side and not the agronomy side. So I think, it happened well before social media, in my opinion. But when that position was combined, then it was more of pushing sales and having quotas and choosing products, and that based on profits for the company and then also the shareholders, and not so much the farmer.
Yesterday I was driving down here, I listened to the Hefty brothers, and they were talking about spraying insecticide on every single acre. And they said that it doesn't kill all the beneficials because they just move into the neighbor's field, or they're in the neighbor's field, and since that guy didn't spray, it's okay to do that. That's just terrible. IPM is like thrown out the window when we start spraying every single acre with insecticide. And they're even talking about, they had an episode where they talked about spraying the ditch banks just to try to get rid of all the stuff that goes into the field from the ditches. It's just, I don't understand that.
I'm glad I got a smartphone that won't play that stuff.
RFD.
I think, if I look back at my career 30, even 20 years ago, and maybe 10 years ago, I mean, most fertilizer dealers, retail locations, companies and whatnot basically had the same suite of products. I mean, you had DAP, potash, anhydrous, you had a UAN product, you had the same chemicals. I mean, everything was basically the same. And so the products that were being sold and the margins in those products was pretty uniform across. I mean, you selected your retailer or whatever based on service and what products they did offer. Now, You know, I know one salesman in particular, he was told, you know, hey, I got to go out and sell $2 million more worth of stuff or I don't get my trip to the Bahamas. Well, what are we selling? We're selling these products that are questionable to start with, that are high margin, and we're promoting this stuff without any science behind it. And so the common sense agronomy, and you know, we can put stuff on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it's called these days, or Snap It or what, I don't know what it's called. It doesn't matter. But I mean, it's pressing the easy button. And you know, all I got to do is tell you, I mean, that's the thing that all these products are 3 bushel. It'll make you 3 bushel. Well, if we'd use all of them, we'd
Or it'll
have,
cost you $6.
yeah, it costs you $6, or it makes you 3 bushels. So if we used all these products, we wouldn't have to have the secrets of crop production. We'd just put all this crap on and we'd have 300 bushel corn and 100 bushel beans.
I think it's really interesting. You see a lot of picture comparisons like early in the season, and then come yield time, it's crickets.
Yeah.
So that in itself should tell you something.
And then when you see yield results, it's this half the field versus this half the field, and that's the only comparison. Where I've seen them where that's adjoining fields not even treated the same.
Or the check moves around.
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
Yeah, includes the headlands with the like untreated.
You could go on and on. I also feel very strongly, and I know it doesn't always happen, but multi-year data as well.
Yeah. Anything can be a fluke once. What you need to be profitable is consistency. You know, what can you continuously use that will give you the best return on investment? And if you're curious about products, I mean, you can definitely look at them, but the universities have weeded out a lot of those. So if they've weeded it out, I probably would go look for something else.
So the Illinois Soybean Association is funding the most research it ever has, probably, I hope I'm saying this correctly, in ISA history. And I'm hoping I say it's 22 research projects. Jennifer is in the back nodding. And so we are very excited for you to hear more about that research today. We are highlighting a lot of the research that's been done in the last several years. And so obviously you've heard some of it already, but stay tuned for this afternoon and some of the breakout sessions. Most of the people that are here have been funded in some way by the Illinois Soybean Association. And so we're really proud of that and really making that a focus, as well as another thing that probably we really need more of in the state is on-farm trialing, or maybe to help more farmers get involved with that in certain areas that they'd like to learn more about. So with that, are there any questions for this group? Get them riled up.
Hi there. Adam Davis, UI Crop Sciences. We just saw that great presentation from Dr. Irwin about having a cost problem in crop production. So where would you recommend growers finding some cost savings? What would be the top recommendations?
I mean, if we're doing our job, they're already at their bare minimum of what they're going to put in. I mean, other than cutting from some crop fertilizer budgets, we are making some changes with some of our pre-emerges on soybeans, and Wisconsin's recommendation is to throw out some of our residual on our post. Other than that, the biggest place to cut is to make sure you're evaluating extra products. A lot of this add-on stuff's where you're spending a lot of your money. I told my clients yesterday that we figured about $100 an acre of farm income this year, which Wisconsin's different. We paid like $150 for land rent, not $350. So, but we also get 75 less bushels of corn than you guys do. But if you're going to go out and gamble on something, you're gambling with 30% of your family's net income by buying a $30 an acre product that you might not need.
What I preach heavily to my customer base is Danny Kleinfelter's 5% rule. And so there's 5% cost that we can cut somewhere. And what we're looking at is cutting the cost out of all the extra junk we're throwing in, the additives, the stickers and all the stuff, the micronutrients into our into our fungicide applications, into our weed control programs. We're looking at a 5%, trying to do a better job getting a yield increase of 5% by looking at proper product placement and populations on hybrids and making sure that we nail that down right in accordance with the seed companies we're growing with, because I believe there's a chance for a 5% yield increase there. And then your marketing, 5%, if you can get a 5% increase in your price. If you can do all three of those things in those three areas, it goes to over 100% return. And so we can go from a negative or return per acre to a very positive return very quickly.
I would say, people always look to fertilizer first, but you can't know what to cut unless you know where you are. So one of the best things you can look at is just doing the soil test so you can see where you are, and maybe you need to spend more on one farm for fertility and less on another based on what those levels show. And then the other thing I'll just say is that, we put a lot of stuff in our tank mixes, and if it doesn't cheese, we assume that it's working, but there can be some chemical incompatibilities that you can't see and you won't notice until the products don't work like you expect them to. So just remember, surfactants are simple. There's no magic about them. They haven't changed in decades, longer than Fred's been here, they haven't changed. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's not magic. A surfactant is a surfactant, and you don't have to buy some super expensive proprietary one. It's still just a surfactant.
I guess I'll add in, a lot of people are realizing that there is integrated pest management, like Kyle mentioned, and that was not just in the coming years. I think in the last couple years, people have been asked, with help with scouting again, we've done field visits, whether or not they need to spray or not spray. That's come up. Another hot topic, I just read an article about it, but I'm very lucky to have a brother that is a mechanic, and he is in demand. So much so he may, go out on his own, but just because there's so many people wanting their machinery to worked on. I think that's another big thing that's happening. Just looking at people are saying, whether or not to add seed treatment, multiple layers of seed treatment. We know that sometimes the SDS component of seed treatment is a lot higher cost. I've been getting questions on that, as well as the rootworm trait. Do we need that or not? You can trap. You can do the trapping if that is something you want to do. Most people don't. But that is something we've eliminated on our farm just because we don't have rootworm pressure there. So those are just a couple things that's come up in phone calls. I just got one last week. Do I really need, they have two planters, right? One for the corn, but do I really need to trick out my soybean planter? No, not really. Yes, for corn, but not necessarily until we, fund a new project, which I'd like to do, but not at this point in time.
And I'll just add in too, if you've already used several passes for weed control, you're probably at a point where the only way you're going to kill those weeds is if you take the actual jug or tote and put it on the weed, and that you don't need to spend money spraying. You need to look at other non-chemical controls. And we have a lot of fields with a lot of resistance that chemicals just are not going to be the answer anymore, so stop flinging the money out at them.
You guys don't pull weeds by hand like I do with a bean hook?
Our fields are a lot bigger than yours.
15 acres average size in my part of Wisconsin, so it's small.
Any other questions?
Just make sure you treat your beans so he doesn't get aroused.
I'm sad that Kyle didn't get out of hand and I didn't have to use my shirt on him.
I can't believe
Good.
you didn't come up. The Hefty brothers were called.
Were
Yes. You said it.
they? Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't mind them, but it's just that IPM thing it's not cool.
Well, I think any social media, I don't even want to use the word agronomist, but whatever, is what the information they give or anybody else gives on social media, is it good information? I think the first thing you got to do is take it and frame it. If you live in North Dakota and you're giving agronomy information, the chances that it applies to Franklin County, Illinois is pretty much zero. So you shouldn't be grabbing that information and trying it or living by it. I mean, that's the first thing. And then also, who's sponsoring those people? I mean, that's my next question. If they're constantly railing on about a product, chances are they're getting sponsored by it. So what are they making on the back end of that?
I would look at a lot of the ones with bigger followers more as celebrities. And so are you going to take your advice on heart medicine from somebody like Kim Kardashian, or are you going to listen to somebody who actually works in the industry and understands from a basic level whether or not something's working?
Have any of you guys used pain test, and then do you have any advice on how to make the big amount of nutrients available that are in the soil available to the plant?
So I think the question was, has any of you actually used the Haney test? And then the second part of the question was?
Okay, I think Connor showed a large amount of minerals in the soil that is not plant available. Do you have any advice on how to move the needle on plant availability?
Okay, oh, sorry. So I will get in trouble if I do not repeat the question. I will.
We don't want you in trouble.
So Connor said there's a lot of nutrients in the soil that are not plant available. How can we unlock that potential as well? Sorry, go ahead. Amy, unlock the potential, Kelly.
I think the first thing you do is make sure that your pH, I can't that has got to be, and so what, again, after that, in Southern Illinois, phosphorus is not really an issue. I mean, 70% of our fields that we sample, and we sample in 25 counties, I don't know, 100,000 plus acres of sample, well, 70 to 100,000 acres a year of soil sampling, 70% of the fields we sample, the phosphate levels are above the optimum. I mean, it's not uncommon for us to find fields with field averages of 70, 80, 100 on a P-test. So phosphorus availability, I'm always amazed at the thought that we need phosphorus availability products. And do those products work that make them available? That's the next question. Can they show that those, these availability things actually work? But the bigger question is going back to Haney, is most times the Haney test is pulled in our area, and I'm speaking specifically to it. So soil health test is pulled and evaluated in our area as a way to sell something. And there's usually not any soil test or anything with it. The other side to that is, where's the calibration data? There is none. And so when Billy Bob shows up and pulls a Haney test on somebody and tells them that they need X, Y, and Z, we can argue all day long about the calibration data that the land-grant universities have on soil fertility. But that is well-researched data and it's published. There's nothing as far as benchmarks or calibration data for various soil types or management practices or crop rotations with soil health.
There's a lot of assumptions with the Haney test, I think. The other thing too is, so some of these products where we're talking about breaking down residue faster, great, that's fine. Maybe that first year you'll see some more availability, but the problem is we take a soil sample in the fall, we take one in the spring to show that it worked. We'd see the same thing almost in a regular field. It might be a little bit exaggerated with where you treated some of your residue, but it's not going to make a huge, huge difference. And then at the end of the day, you're breaking down residue faster, so you're basically taking on a home equity loan on that fertilizer that you had in that residue that slowly would have been available over those 4 or 5 years, and you're taking it all at once without putting it back, which is what they're recommending. You just don't need any fertilizer. You're just going to put this on. You're going to get residue to break down. You get all the nutrients, and then you don't have to apply fertilizer. 4 or 5 years later, those guys that use those products are calling me and telling me my soil test levels are atrocious. I'm losing yield now. I can't believe I started using those products 4 years ago, and it's the biggest one that sells it right now. Their customers in their area that they grew up around are calling me now and telling me that that's what's happening to their soils.
Well, and you can mine for a little bit, but the bottom will drop out, and you will never be able to afford to get that back up to where it is with today's prices. So,
I think it's interesting. One of the things my major professor, when I did my master's degree, when he passed away, they cleaned his office out. One of the publications I got out of there was, I'm trying to remember if it was publication 24, it was C.B. Hopkins from 1908. He basically warns against, biological products in a way and mining, mining the soil, and that some of these products that we put back on in the name of trying to make things available don't work. So 120 years ago, nothing's changed much.
Yeah, and these biologicals, if they discovered a biological that you could spray on your soil that would break phosphorus down and it would stay there forever, they would never sell it to you. They would never make that product because then they couldn't sell it to you ever again.
And I think you need to look at where a lot of these companies came from. And a lot of them is investor money that have nothing to do with agriculture. And I think going forward with the way the economy is changing, we're going to see more of that investor money go back out of ag. So it'll be interesting to see what is left. But there's a lot of things that people make a startup hoping to be bought by a larger company, and that was really their only goal to begin with. It wasn't to have a product that worked. So those are just things to think about.
Good point.
You have a question in the back.
So I think his question up front there kind of was danced around a little bit in the aspect of, the question was, there's data out there, whether it's from a Haney test or whether it's university, that there is a surplus of nutrition in the soil profile. Do you feel like there are mechanisms out there that can help access that? Or do you feel like, no, fertilizer is the key going forward?
I think those processes, especially like some of the biological products, I think you can maybe speed it up, but it depends on what strain is in that and what's going on with it. There's some of the talk about putting sugar on, so we're going to increase our biological activity with sugar or humics or fulvics. And I think it varies from soil type to soil type. In those bacteria that are in our soil currently, we try to say that we know what's going on. There's a lot of people that say that they know what's going on in your soil. When they do DNA testing, they say 70% of what they come back with for DNA testing, they can't identify. They don't know what's in it. And trying to tell somebody that your soil should have this amount of whatever bacteria in it isn't really accurate, because I don't know if my soils are going to be the same as yours, but I'm pretty sure they're not. And it's a lot of pseudoscience and trying to figure this stuff out. Maybe eventually we'll get there, but I don't think we're there right now. There's a lot of phosphorus there, but it gets broken down very slowly over time, and that's why it builds up in that soil. We used to use a lot more rock phosphate and triple superphosphate than what we do now. So,
and I think too, if you look at, again, speaking from my area, the likelihood that we're going to break some of that stuff loose and make it work for us, so to speak, on a 1.5–2% organic matter is a lot less likely to happen than going west of town here, where you're in a 5 or 6% organic matter. We just don't have it to start with to break loose, and the chances of it showing up. And I think going back to some of the information that was showed earlier, we've seen that, we can grow 100 bushel beans on a potash test that's a third of what's optimum. And that's because we are getting some of that release, and because of the way it's growing and what that research was showing. I agree with that. So are those nutrients available? Yeah. And, in our clay soils, especially our clay knobs, the time of day and the angle of the sun and how much moisture you got is going to determine more than anything else you do.
It depends.
It depends.
That got brought up last night, too.
I think the key is you have to, solve the big problems first, which his operation is past that. So he's probably in a little bit he's having to figure out things on his own because the rest of the people aren't there with him. So, is there something out there? Maybe. You have to work on cycling your nutrients, and that's going to be a lot in your system. So I'd say that you're a little bit farther ahead than most people, at least up here. I don't know back there, but and so it's hard to make a blanket statement, knowing that if I say, oh yes, this will work, for 80% of you, you're not there. So you have to look at your most yield limiting factor, and that's what you have to attack first. And I feel like, people will sell you micronutrients, but if your problem is potassium, micronutrients aren't going to help that much. So you really have to know for your own operation what the problem is.
Honestly, as an independent consultant, the thing that surprised me the most was that people tell me that's just common sense. I don't understand why you're telling me about this. And I'm like, well, your soil sample says 10 parts per million of phosphorus. I'm like, you don't fix that, you're not going to fix anything else.
I only know pounds per acre here.
Oh, parts per million, yeah. So it'd be 20 pounds per acre, yeah.
Oh, there's math again, Connor. Math. So with that, hearing that, do you encourage on-farm trialing then? And Are you doing that a lot with your clients, customers? What are thoughts on that?
I think I will tell every one of my customers, whatever that, if it's a Haney test, if it's cover crops, if it's food juice, I don't care. Try some, buy it, put it out. Let's do replicated trials. Let's do replicated strips, treating half the field and not half the field or whatever. And we're going to measure it with either a weigh wagon or a yield monitor and not looking in the grain tank saying it's 3 inches higher, okay? That, sadly, that's how most evaluations are made. Is your yield monitor even calibrated? That might help too. Decide what some of this stuff is. So yeah, I totally encourage that. And we learn from that. And what we learn, the other thing too is the variability of the acres you farm. I mean, I've got customers that farm all the way from blow sands to black, highly organic soils down in the south. And so, what works on this side of the farm or in this field does not work over here. So you've got to know for your operation.
I think trials are always a good idea, and that's kind of where it ends sometimes, that it's a good idea, unless we come and dump the jug in your planter or... So I ended up buying, I run a John Deere Gator, which you can make fun of me for that because I probably overpaid for it, I'm sure. But I run a Dakota FS manufacturing sprayer. It's 20-foot booms, essentially 8 rows at a time. I have a 450 Raven rate controller in it. I run an RTK setup from John Deere, and it all goes through a John Deere monitor. So in my mind, if I don't do it, they're not going to do it. So I pressure my guys for stuff that they want to try the next year, and I just take care of it.
I guess it depends on which client is asking, because some of them are super detailed and willing to do everything to a T, and others just don't have time. So if you don't want to put in check strips and you don't want to do the details, then on-farm trialing is not the best option for you. Some people just have too many acres to get across, and it's just not practical. So, definitely it depends on the grower and what their logistics and situation are.
Well, I mean, we all have those guys that at the end of the day, they're like, yeah, I don't have time for that plot, but what did my neighbors yield? And you're like, well, last year you said his data was junk because it's your neighbor. So it's just... I only got one laugh out of that.
I think the other thing that enables to do some research, and I'll put that in parentheses, is the precision farming tools we have. So you can lay out these trials and highlight them in the field and mark them and such so that, I just literally a while ago got a text from one of my customers showing his fungicide trial on the planter, and from the different fields where he had that marked out and was able to go in and pull that data out and look at the differences in yield. So you can do those things, lay them out this time of year and then look at them a year later and do it in such a way that it's not very intrusive.
Okay. With that, I'm going to say one last thing before I let DeLoss take over and give you your instructions. I'm looking out into a lot of hungry little faces out there. So I just want to give a shout out for all you guys today. Thank you so much for coming. You will be here later to answer any hard questions.
I'm leaving.
Secret questions.
If you're mad, ask Kyle.
I rented a car and drove from Illinois to here, Wisconsin. If there's a truck out there with my name on it, that's somebody else.
So if you have not heard, the Illinois Soybean Association Agronomy team is entering the realm of on-farm trialing. And so we have started to, if you use the word recruit, I don't know if that's the correct terminology, but accept applications for those that are interested in doing on-farm trialing. If you have any questions about that, see Deanna. We're also helping some of the researchers, like, for example, Dr. Nick Sider, who I see in the back of the room, recruit to get him some on-farm trialing for his ISA-funded research, as well as we are starting, and we want to do more, but in the coming year, we're starting out doing on-farm trialing soybeans with sulfur. And so if that's something that interests you, please see myself or Deanna throughout the day, and we'll get you some more information on that. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you. It's lunchtime. We will eat back here. We'll come back here. Food is over there.